Welcome back to Cosmic Wand, where the impossible gets its turn to speak. Today's adventure: Harry was locked in a forgotten vault where one day was a century and returned stronger than Dumbledore. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so the next story finds you the moment it drops. Settle in and let's begin. Chapter 1: The Vault Where Hours Drowned. The letter arrived with the proper seals, and that was the first thing Harry would later learn to distrust. It came by Ministry Owl, not the snowy blur of Hedwig or the harassed Hogwarts barn owls, but a heavy gray bird with a leg like a banister rail. The parchment bore 3 wax stamps: the Ministry's portcullis, the looping G of Gringotts, and a third he didn't recognize, a circle bisected by a single horizontal line, like an eye that had decided to stop seeing. Harry turned it over twice. He had spent the summer in a house full of people who handled him the way you handle a parcel marked fragile and addressed to someone else, and he had learned that official documents usually meant someone had decided something about his life without asking. The letter said his name. It said that following the events of June, his trust vault required a ward reattunement and beneficiary audit, and that for reasons of security this could not be conducted by post. It said an officer of the Department of Mysteries would collect him at 10 o'clock. It said the headmaster had reviewed and approved the arrangement. That last line was the part that worked on him. Harry read it the way a fish reads the gleam of a lure, which is to say he did not read it at all, he simply moved toward it. Dumbledore had approved. Dumbledore, who had spent a year not looking at him, who arranged Harry's life with the offhand confidence of a man rearranging furniture in a room he rarely entered. If Dumbledore had signed off, then the worst Harry could expect was to be bored and patronized, and he had a great deal of practice at surviving both. He should have asked which was worse, that Dumbledore had approved it, or that someone had been clever enough to know writing those 4 words would end the argument before it began. The officer came at 10 exactly. His name was Aurelian Crewe, and he was the sort of man you forgot while you were still looking at him. Gray suit, gray hair combed with the precision of a ruled line, a face assembled from the cheaper, more durable emotions. He did not smile in greeting. He did not offer his hand. He stood in the doorway of number 12, Grimmauld Place, and consulted a slim black ledger, and when he spoke it was to the ledger. Potter Harry James, born 31 July. Sole beneficiary of Vault 687, presently. Presently, Harry repeated. Vaults change, Crewe said, as though this were a comment on the weather. He closed the ledger. His eyes, when they finally rose to Harry's, were the color of standing water. You'll want a cloak, the lower levels are cold. There had been an argument about whether anyone should go with him. Harry remembered that later with the particular clarity reserved for the moment before a door you can't reopen. Mrs. Weasley had wanted to come. Sirius had wanted to come and had been forbidden, his face shut like a slammed window because a wanted man could not exactly stroll into Gringotts. And there had been a note, hand-delivered by an owl in the looping slanted hand Harry knew from the bottoms of countless letters. Albus regrets he cannot attend personally. The matter is routine. Trust the department's man. The seal at the bottom was the phoenix. Everyone in that kitchen had relaxed by half a degree, including Harry, and so the thing was decided, and so Harry put on his cloak. Nobody noticed that the note had not actually been signed. He thought about it on the walk to the Floo Point, in the dim back-and-forth way you tongue a loose tooth. The handwriting was right. He would have sworn to the handwriting. But Dumbledore signed things. Dumbledore signed things with a flourish that took up half a line, a man fond of his own name. And this note ended at the seal, the phoenix pressed crisp into the wax, and no Albus beneath it. Harry told himself a seal was better than a signature. A signature could be forged by anyone with a steady hand. A seal needed the actual ring. He thought the reasoning watertight. It is worth recording that it was completely wrong, because the people who built the trap had owned a great many rings, and the ring was the easy part. The descent into Gringotts is a thing the wizarding world treats as an amusement, like a fairground ride bolted onto the side of a bank. Harry had done it before. He knew the lurch of the cart, the cold air pressing past his ears, the strobe of torchlight smearing the walls. What he did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that the public descent stops well short of the bottom. The goblin driving the cart was old. Harry registered this in the dull way you register the make of a passing car, an impression, no detail. The goblin's knuckles were the color and texture of walnuts, and he did not speak, and when Crewe murmured a word in gobbledygook, the cart did not slow at the platform Harry expected. It went past the next one too. The torches grew further apart and then stopped entirely, and the only light was a witchfire lamp swinging on the cart's prow, throwing the rock walls into a churn of orange and black. This isn't the way to my vault, Harry said. No, Crewe agreed. The track here was not the smooth iron of the upper bank. It was older, narrower, and in places it ran along the lip of drops the lamp could not find the bottom of. Harry leaned and looked down once and saw nothing, a nothing that had weight, a darkness that felt less like absence of light and more like the presence of something that ate it. He sat back. He told himself the cold in his stomach was the speed. He had his wand. He noted that, the way you check for your keys. He had his wand, and he was Harry Potter, and the worst thing that had ever tried to kill him had failed at it half a dozen times, and there was a reflexive comfort in that arithmetic that he would spend the next several lifetimes unlearning. The audit, he said, because silence was worse. What is it exactly? Crew answered without turning. His voice carried oddly down here, flattened, refusing to give itself back off the rock. Every vault in Gringotts is anchored to a lattice. You may think of it as a web if it helps, though the comparison flatters the web. The lattice holds the vaults in their proper relation to one another and to the world above. Most of it is mundane, some of it is not. The deepest anchors require from time to time a fresh attunement. He paused. You have been selected as an attunement. You said an audit of my vault. I said a number of things. They were necessary. Crew's tone did not change at all, and that was the part that began finally to get under Harry's skin, the absolute economy of it, the sense of a man reading aloud from a schedule. You will find I dislike lying, Mr. Potter. It is inefficient and it leaves residue, but I am permitted certain omissions, and you would not have come if I had filled them in. The cart slowed. It came to rest at a platform that was not a platform so much as a tongue of stone extended into the dark, and the dark here was total, the kind that pours into your eyes and pools there. The witchfire lamp lit a circle perhaps 10 feet across, and at the edge of that circle stood a door. Harry had seen the great dragon-guarded vaults. He had seen the high doors with their 1,000 locks. This was not like those. This door was low, no taller than he was, and round, and it was made of something that was not metal and not stone, a dull greenish dark like the underside of deep water. Across its face ran a single spiral groove, starting at the rim and winding inward to a center point, and the spiral was filled with characters Harry's eyes kept sliding off, not because they were small, but because they did not want to be looked at, the way a bright afterimage skates away when you try to fix it. Above the door, set into the rock, was a slab. On the slab, in letters that had been cut deep and then worn shallow by something that was not weather, because there was no weather down here, were 3 words in a script old enough that he could only read it because some part of the magic in the place made him able to. The oubliette of years. I don't understand, Harry said. He would hold on to it later, across the long erosion of his memory that his voice had stayed level. What is this place? The old goblin spoke at last. He did not look at Harry. He looked at the door, and there was something in his face that Harry would not have a word for until much later, when he had nothing but time to find words in. It was the look of someone at a funeral he has attended too often to grieve it properly. A debt, the goblin said, older than the bank, older than the treaty. The deep anchors were not built by us. We only keep the keys. His walnut knuckles tightened on the cart's rail. And the keys must turn. Harry was already running the problem, because running problems was the only thing he had ever been reliably good at. The cart was behind Crew. The goblin would not help. The goblin had called it a debt, and would no more interfere with a debt than a tide would apologize to a drowning man. Disapparition was impossible inside Gringotts, and twice impossible this far down. That left the wand, and the wand had felt wrong since the last platform, lighter in his hand, the spells he reached for arriving a half-second slow, the magic in him thinning the way a torch dims when it is carried into a room with no air. The deeper they had gone, the less of himself he had brought. He understood that this too was by design, that whatever the deep anchors were, they had been built by people who knew exactly how a cornered wizard would think and had spent 6 centuries closing every exit that thought could find. Crew stepped down onto the stone. He moved without hurry, with the flat ease of a man performing a routine he had performed 100 times, and Harry understood with a lurch that had nothing to do with the cart that this was exactly what was happening, a routine, not an execution. Not even a punishment, a scheduled maintenance, and Harry was the part being replaced. How many, Harry said, before me, how many attunements? Crew looked at him then with something that was almost interest, the flicker of a man noting that a tool has an unexpected feature. You're quick, I'll record that. It won't change anything, but I'll record it. He drew his wand, a pale thing the color of old bone, and touched it to the center of the spiral. The honest answer is that I don't know. The records begin in the 1400s, and they were copied from records that no longer exist. The dishonest answer, which I prefer because it is shorter, is enough. The spiral began to turn. It did not grind. That was the worst of it. A door that size should have shrieked on its hinge, should have announced itself, but the green dark mass simply revolved, soundless, the characters in the groove rearranging themselves into new orders that hurt to follow, and a gap opened at the center and widened, and out of the gap came air. The air was the thing Harry remembered most clearly across all the years that followed, because it was the last new thing from the world above that he would smell for a very long time. It was not foul. It braced for rot for the sweet thickness of a tomb. Instead, it was clean and cold and utterly without character, the air of a place where nothing had lived long enough to leave a trace, where even decay had given up and gone home. It smelled of stone and of distance, and faintly underneath, of something he could not place and would spend 3 of his lives trying to, a smell like the inside of a struck bell, a smell like the space between 2 ticks of a clock. You can't, Harry said. He had the wand up now. He did not remember deciding to raise it. You can't just put people in there. I can, and the proof is that I have, and the further proof is that you are about to be one of them. Crew did not raise his own wand, he did not need to, and both of them knew it, and the knowledge sat between them like a third person. Resist if you like, it's traditional. The lattice prefers a struggle, actually. Resentment binds better than despair. Despair is a slow leak. Resentment is structural. Harry cast. Of course he cast. He was 15, and he had a wand and a stubbornness that had carried him through a graveyard and a basilisk and a sky full of dementors, and he threw the first hard hex he could reach for a reductor straight at Crew's chest, and the spell crossed the 10 feet of lit stone and struck something a hand's breadth from the gray suit and stopped. It did not deflect. It did not splash. It simply arrived at a place where the rules were different and ceased to be a spell, the way a wave ceases to be a wave when it reaches the flat of the beach, and the red light spread thin across an invisible curve and drank away into the dark. The lattice, Crew said in the tone of a man explaining a fee structure, does not permit violence on its threshold. You'll find it permits a great deal once you're inside. That's rather the point. Harry ran. There was nowhere to run. The platform was a tongue of stone over a drop with no bottom, and the cart was behind Crew, and the only door was the round green dark mouth. And so what he did in the end, the last free act of the person he had been, was the thing that any cornered creature does, which is to go toward the only opening there is. He thought, in the disordered way of panic, that a room was better than a fall. He thought he might find another way out from the inside. He thought a great many comforting and incorrect things in the space of 3 strides, and then the threshold was under his feet, and the cold, clean air closed over him like water, and behind him, soundless, the spiral began to turn the other way. For what it's worth, Crew said, and his flat voice came through the narrowing gap with perfect clarity, the way the last of the light always finds the eye, you were not chosen at random. You were chosen because you are difficult to kill. Addis needs an anchor that will last. Most of them give out in a decade. The estimate for you is considerably longer. A pause, the schedule consulted one final time. I'm told to tell you that this is for the greater good. I don't know whose. I only deliver the message. The gap became a slit. The slit became a line. The line closed, and the soundlessness of it was a violence all its own, and Harry Potter was alone in the dark in a room that the world had spent 600 years forgetting on purpose. For a while he did the things a person does. He shouted. The room took the sound and gave nothing back, no echo, which told him before his hands did that the space was larger than he could feel. He felt his way along the wall, and the wall was smooth and curved and went on, and he counted his steps to map it and lost count past 400 and started again and lost count again. He cast lumos and the wand light bloomed and showed him gray stone and a floor of fitted flags, and at the limit of the light, more gray stone and nothing else, and he walked toward the something at the edge of the light, and the edge of the light walked away from him because that is what edges do. He pounded on the door. He found it by walking the wall until his fist met the green dark mass, colder than the stone, and he hit it until his knuckles split, and the dark drank the blood the way it drank the light. He shouted Crew's name and then Dumbledore's name and then names that were only sounds. He threatened, he bargained. He went in the space of what felt like hours and was, he would later calculate, the better part of a subjective week, through the whole catalogue of a trapped animal, and the room received all of it with the same flat patience and gave back the same flat dark. The dark was the part there were no lessons for. The dark had been an enemy when he was a small child in the cupboard, and he had outgrown it the ordinary way, by learning that the dark was only the absence of a thing you could switch back on. This dark could not be switched. His lumos lit a sphere the size of a dinner table, and the sphere proved how much dark there was rather than reducing it. After a while he stopped casting it, partly to spare the thinned magic and partly because the lit sphere was worse, a bright island that made him a target for whatever the imagination stalks the edges of vision with when the eyes have nothing real to do. So he sat in the absolute black, and his mind, deprived of the outside, turned its full attention inward, and he learned that a human being given nothing to look at will manufacture things to look at, and that the things it manufactures are rarely kind. And then, because he was 15 and exhausted, and his body did not yet understand that the rules had changed, he slept. When he woke he was hungry, and that was the second thing that taught him. He was hungry, which meant time had passed, his body insisting on its small arithmetic of need, and he had no food, and a clean immediate certainty arrived to replace the diffuse one. He was going to starve in the dark. He was going to die slowly in a room that did not echo, 600 years deep, and no one would come, because the note had not been signed and the people who loved him had relaxed by half a degree and let him go. He did not starve. This was the third thing, and it was the worst, because it meant the place intended to keep him. He understood it slowly across what his stomach told him was 3 days and was, he would learn, 3 centuries of subjective endurance compressed into the same indifferent dark. The hunger sharpened, and then at the edge of unbearable it stopped sharpening. It plateaued. It became a permanent background ache, the body's complaint kept always at the threshold of crisis and never permitted to resolve because the vault would not feed him and would not let him die of not being fed. Cold worked the same way. He shivered until shivering became a constant, and then his body simply held there, never warming, never freezing, suspended at the exact uncomfortable point where survival becomes a sentence rather than an event. He pinched his split knuckles once hard to watch them not heal and not worsen, and the small ache held steady for what might have been a year, a thin red line of evidence that the place kept its prisoners exactly, eternally, at the worst tolerable point. The oubliette did not want him alive because it cared. It wanted him alive the way a battery wants charge. He was a load-bearing element. Crew had said as much in his flat schedule of a voice, and Harry, walking the curved wall in the dark with his split knuckles and his permanent hunger, finally heard it, an anchor that will last. It was during the long, unmeasured dark of what he would come to call the first silence that Harry began to lose his grip, and it was important, in the accounting he made much later, that he be honest about how completely. He talked to people who were not there. He held entire conversations with Ron about Quidditch, took both sides, laughed at his own jokes in Ron's voice, and went cold when he caught himself doing it. He explained things to Hermione, patient, elaborate explanations of his situation, and she explained back, and her explanations were better than his because some part of him that had paid attention to her for 4 years could still simulate the shape of her thinking, and that was almost unbearable, to have a clever friend made entirely of your own solitude telling you reasonable things in your own skull. He apologized to Sirius. He apologized to his parents, whom he had never met and so had to build out of photographs and other people's memories, and he found that the constructed versions forgave him too easily, and he hated them for it, and then hated himself, and the dark received all of it without comment. He thought about dying on purpose. He was honest about that too later. He stood at the lip of nothing, where the floor of the vault gave way to a drop he had found by nearly walking off it, and he held his wand and considered the spells he knew that might end it cleanly, and he found that he did not know any, that nobody had ever taught him how to die, only how to keep not dying, and the absurdity of that, the sheer administrative oversight of it, was what brought him back from the edge. He started laughing. He laughed in the dark until the laugh stopped being a laugh, and he sat down on the cold flags with his back to the nothing, and somewhere in the wreckage of that hour a hard small-voiced thing in him that had been waiting all this time for the noise to stop finally spoke. It said how long, not why. Why was a question for people with audiences? Why assumed a listener, a court, an appeal? There was no court here and no appeal, and the only listener was the dark, and the dark did not deal in why. But how long was a question he could work on. How long was a measurement, and a measurement was a foothold, and a foothold was the first thing in 3 centuries of subjective dark that had felt like the world above, where Harry Potter had solved problems by being too stubborn to admit they were unsolvable. He was honest even then about how much of that stubbornness had been borrowed. Stubbornness needs an audience the way a fire needs air. He had been brave at Hogwarts because Ron was beside him and Hermione was watching, and there was a teacher to disappoint or a dark lord to spite, and bravery performed for witnesses is a different metal from bravery in the dark. Here there were no witnesses. Here there was only the arithmetic and the dark and the question, and he discovered that the question was enough. The question did not care whether anyone was watching. The question only wanted to be answered. That, he would think much later, was the first real thing the oubliette taught him, before he had read a single page, that he could want something with no one there to want it for, so he began to count. He had no day and no night and no hunger that moved, but he had his own pulse, and he had the slow grind of his thoughts, and he had, when he searched the dark methodically on his hands and knees, a single irregularity in the otherwise perfect floor, a flag near the wall that had been scratched. Scratched deliberately. He felt the grooves with his fingertips in the absolute dark because his lumos exhausted him now in a way it had not at first. The magic itself thinned by the place, and what he felt was tally marks. Hundreds of them, thousands, cut into the stone in clusters of 5s, the universal grammar of the imprisoned, and they ran along the base of the wall in both directions further than his hands could follow. He was not the first. He had known that abstractly since Crew had said it. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and reading it in the dark with your fingers, feeling the desperate arithmetic of strangers who had sat exactly here, in exactly this cold, and counted exactly this nothing, and run out of wall or run out of self and stopped. Some clusters were neat, some were a frenzy. In one place the mark simply became a gouge, a single deep furrow worn by a hand that had given up on counting and only wanted to feel the stone yield to it, and Harry put his thumb in that furrow and held it there and understood that this was where someone had decided that being a measurement was worse than being nothing, and had stopped being a measurement. He took his wand. He found, by feel, the place where the last legible cluster ended. And he began very carefully to add his own marks, and as he cut the first 5 he did the thing that saved him, which was not optimism, because optimism was a luxury for people who could see the door. He did arithmetic. He had slept, he reasoned, some number of times. His body still kept its old human rhythm under the suspended hunger and cold, still wanted sleep on something like a daily cycle, and he had been counting sleeps without meaning to, the way you count stairs in the dark. He was somewhere near his 300th sleep, and the air, when the door had opened, had moved a certain way. and Crew had said most of them give out in a decade, said it about people, ordinary people, who would have died of starvation in a fortnight if the vault had let them, which meant the vault was holding them past death the way it held him, which meant a decade of a person's endurance was being measured against an outside clock that ran very, very differently. He worked it for a long time. He worked it the way Hermione would have worked it, building the calculation in the dark with no parchment, holding each figure in his head until the next one was ready, and when it resolved he sat very still because the number was not a number a mind is built to hold. The marks on the wall were not days, they were not even years, the frenzied gouges, the runs of thousands, the strangers who had sat here and counted until counting broke them, they had been counting against the outside. He had felt as he felt the slow human drip of their own hours, and they had set those hours against the world they remembered, and they had watched the gap open up between the time they lived and the time the world would credit them, and the gap was the thing that drove the furrows into the stone. A day outside, a century inside. He checked it 3 times because the alternative was to believe it on the first pass, and you do not believe a thing like that on the first pass and survive. But it held. The hunger held. The cold held, the thousands of marks held. He had been here by his own pulse the better part of a year of subjective time, and the sun above London had not finished going down on the afternoon Crew had handed him into the dark. Harry sat with that in the dark for what might have been a week, and here's the thing he was honest about in the end across all the centuries. He did not rise to the occasion. There was no moment of swelling resolve, no clenched promise to a dead mother, no vow. Those came later, and they were not the thing that turned him. The thing that turned him was smaller and meaner and far more durable, and it arrived not as a feeling but as a sentence fully formed, in a voice he recognized as his own only because there was no one else's left to borrow. They built this to break people, the sentence said, and it works. It has worked thousands of times. It is, in fact, the most successful thing in this room. And then after a silence in which the dark waited, so the question isn't whether I get out. The question is whether I'm going to be one more set of marks on the wall or whether I'm going to be the thing that finally reads the room. It was not hope which looks up. This looked sideways at the architecture of the trap itself. It carried the same flat attention Harry had once turned on a devil's snare, when he understood that the answer was not to fight harder but to learn what the plant wanted. The oubliette wanted endurance. It fed on resentment, Crew had said, fed on the slow burn of a mind set against its cage, and Harry had been pouring that fuel into it for a subjective year, screaming and bargaining and grieving, doing exactly what every set of marks before him had done, being a perfect anchor, a model prisoner, a battery that complained. What he asked the dark would happen if I stopped being fuel and started being a reader. The dark, as always, did not answer. But for once since the spiral closed, Harry felt the silence change shape. Not warm, nothing here was warm, but attentive, the way a room goes attentive when someone clever finally stops shouting and starts thinking. And somewhere far off in the vault, at the edge of the something his light could never reach, he had the distinct and unprovable sense that he was no longer the only thing in the room that had noticed him. He got to his feet. His knees had stopped hurting a long time ago. The vault would not let him be injured enough to matter, only enough to feel. He cast lumos and the light came thin and grudging, and he did not waste it on the dark this time. He turned it on the wall. He had been treating the oubliette as a cell, 4 walls and a sealed door, and that was the mistake of a person from a world where rooms are for living in. A vault is not a cell. A vault is for keeping things. And a vault built by hands older than the bank, anchored to a lattice that held the deep places of the world in their proper relation. A vault that the goblins did not build and only kept the keys to, was not going to be an empty gray box with a scratched floor. He raised the light and walked away from the door, toward the center of the room, toward the something at the edge of the dark that had been retreating from him for a subjective year, and this time he did not chase it. He walked steadily, the way you approach an animal you do not want to startle, and the edge of the light slid forward over fitted flags, and over a long pale shape that resolved, as he came up on it, into the bones of someone who had counted the wall and lost, laid out neat, hands folded, a person who had decided to compose themselves at the end, and Harry stopped and looked at that for a while and did not flinch. Because flinching was a thing you did for an audience, and he had buried his audience months ago. "All right," he said to the bones. His voice in the dead air was rough from disuse and steadier than it had any right to be. "You ran out of wall. I understand. I nearly did." He crouched. There was a ring on the folded finger bones, a heavy thing with the same bisected circle mark that had been on the letter's 3rd seal, and Harry left it where it was, because he had a sudden strong sense that some debts should not be collected by the next prisoner. But you were sitting in the dark counting the wall, and the whole time you had your back to the room. He stood and he raised the light and he turned it past the bones into the center of the oubliette of years, and the thin grudging wanlight fell at last on the thing the vault had been built to keep. There were shelves, not a few, not a study's worth. The light found the first rank of them and then another behind it, and then the suggestion of more beyond, ranks of black shelving that ran up past the reach of the light and back past the reach of imagination, and they were full. Books, cases. Objects under cloth and objects that needed no cloth, instruments of brass gone green and crystal gone milk, scrolls in racks like wine, tablets of stone and tablets of something that was not stone, a hoard not of gold but of the thing that gold is only a clumsy symbol for, the thing that every vault in Gringotts was a pale imitation of keeping. Knowledge, centuries of it, lifetimes of it. The accumulated, sequestered, deliberately forgotten learning of an age that had built doors to bury its most dangerous treasures, and had chosen this place, the deepest and most patient prison it owned, to bury the most dangerous treasure of all. The scale of it did something strange to his sense of where he stood. A library is supposed to sit inside a building, and a building inside a city, and a city inside a world, each thing nested in something larger until you reach the sky and stop. Here the nesting ran the wrong way. The shelves did not sit inside the vault. The vault, he understood, looking up the black ranks into a dark that did not end so much as decline to be measured, was only the antechamber to the shelves. They went up past where ceilings have business being. They went back past where walls agree to meet. Somewhere in their depths, the careful geometry of a room gave way to the careless geometry of a thing that had been growing, accreting, gathering to itself across a span of time that made the 600 years since the bank's founding look like the pause between two words. Whoever had begun this collection had not been hoarding against a rainy decade. They had been hoarding against the end of everything, and they had been at it long enough that the collection had started in some quiet, patient way to hoard back. And they had been throwing people in here to die next to it for 600 years. Harry stood at the edge of that hoard with his thin light and his permanent hunger and the bones of his predecessor at his feet, and the sentence that came to him then was not a cry and was not a prayer and was, in its way, the first true thing the new Harry ever said, the Harry who would one day walk out of this place into a single unfinished London afternoon, with the weight of centuries folded behind his eyes. They gave me a day a century, he thought, and they left me alone in a library. He looked at the shelves climbing into the dark, more of them than he could ever count, more time ahead of him than the human mind was built to face, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the cold pleasure of a problem finally turning the right way up. They really should have signed the note. He took the first book down from the first shelf. The cover was cold and the leather had outlasted the men who cured it, and the lock on its clasp was the kind that bites. And Harry sat down with his back to the bones and the dark in the door, opened his thin starving light over the first page of the first of 10,000 teachers, and began in a place where one day was 100 years and he had all the time that had ever been to read. The hunger stayed, the cold stayed, the dark stayed, patient and enormous and no longer entirely empty. But the counting changed. He did not stop cutting marks into the wall. He was too careful for that, too aware that a man who loses count of himself becomes the gouge and then the bones. The marks meant something different now. They were not a measure of how long he had suffered. They were a measure of how long he had to work. Far back in the dark, past the ranks of shelves, in the place the light would not reach for another 3 lifetimes yet, something that had been bound there before the bank was built, before the treaty, before the words on the slab were cut and worn shallow, registered that the newest of its long parade of dying neighbors had, against every precedent of 600 years, sat down to read. It had eaten despair for so long it had forgotten the taste of anything else. It was, in the only way such a thing could be, intrigued. Harry turned the page, the wand light held, and the first century began. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, the discipline of centuries. The first problem was light, and as he solved it told him everything about the next 100 years. His Lumos was dying, not the spell, the well. Every casting cost him more and returned less, the vault drinking off the top of his magic the way a tax collector skims a cart, and he had calculated in his methodical new arithmetic that at his current rate of reading he would run out of usable Lumos somewhere in his second decade and spend the remaining 98 years of that century in a dark too complete to read by. A library you cannot see is just a heavier kind of cell. So he stopped trying to make light and started trying to understand why he couldn't. This was the change that mattered, and he noticed himself making it. The old Harry would have cast harder, would have gritted out a brighter Lumos and felt clever for an afternoon and run dry by spring. The person sitting in the dark with a stolen grimoire open on his knees did something the old Harry had never once done in 5 years of magical education, which was to ask what the rules actually were before deciding to break them. The grimoire helped. It was the third book he had pulled from the first shelf, written in a cramped continental hand by someone who signed nothing, and it was about wards, and the chapter that saved him was titled, in the dead language the vault let him read, On the Feeding of Bound Places. The author had been a builder of prisons. He wrote about confinement the way a vintner writes about barrels, with affection and a craftsman's contempt for anyone who got it wrong, and on the 4th page he explained, almost in passing, that the most efficient cells did not block magic. Blocking magic was crude and expensive and tended to fail at the worst moment like a dam. The elegant solution was to make the cell thirsty. You let the prisoner cast all he liked. You simply arranged for the casting to feed the walls. Harry read that paragraph 11 times. Then he set the book down on the bones of his predecessor who had become, by unspoken arrangement, his reading desk, and he sat in the dark and considered thirst. If the vault drank his magic when he pushed it outward, then the answer was not to push. He had been casting lumos the only way he had been taught, a flexion of will that flung light away from the wand tip into the room, an act of generosity, and the room was a sponge that loved generous wizards. What he wanted was the opposite of generosity. He wanted to make light that did not leave him. Light he kept. It took him, by the marks on the wall, 2 years. He would describe it later, on the rare occasions he described any of it, as learning to whisper in a language he had only ever shouted. He stopped flinging the spell and started holding it. He drew the magic up out of the deep place behind his sternum where it lived, and instead of throwing it at the wand, he let it pool in the wand, a steady banked warmth, and he found the exact point of restraint where the light glowed without trying to go anywhere, and the vault, which fed on motion, on the outward generous gesture, found nothing to drink. A flame in a sealed jar does not feed the wind. First time he held a steady wand light for an hour without losing a drop, he laughed, and the laugh was almost the old one. He had a lamp now, more than a lamp. He had proof that the trap had rules, and that rules, once known, were just instructions for the patient read backward. That was the first century's true lesson, and he learned it in the first 2 years and spent the other 98 applying it to everything else. The oubliette was not a wall, it was a grammar, and he was going to become fluent. He built a regimen because a person with infinite time and no structure becomes the gouge in the floor. He understood the danger clearly now. The strangers who had counted the wall to madness had not been weak. They had simply had nothing to do with the hours but feel them, and a feeling with nothing to push against curdles. The cure was work, and the work had to be scheduled, because a schedule was a way of being 2 people, the one who decided and the one who obeyed, and 2 people is 1 more than 0, and 0 was what the dark wanted you to be. So he made days, arbitrary, defiant days. He slept when his body asked and called the waking a morning. He read for a measured span and called it a session. He practiced for a span and called it a drill. He walked the wall for a span, the whole circuit, touching the tally marks, and called it the watch. And the watch was the most important hour because it was where he kept count of himself, not the years, the self. He would recite on the watch the things a person could lose without noticing. His name, the names of the people he had loved, the color of the sky, the taste of treacle tart, the exact weight of a snitch closing into his fist against the odds. He recited them not because the reciting was pleasant, but because a thing unspoken in a place like this simply leaves quietly while you are busy surviving, and one day you reach for it and there is a smooth place in your mind where it used to be, like the furrow in the floor. He lost things anyway. He was honest about that in the accounting. The friends went first, and he let them go on purpose, which was worse than losing them by accident. The simulated Ron and the simulated Hermione had kept him company through the first silence, and somewhere in the second decade, he understood that they were a kindness that had become a leak. Every hour he spent talking to a Hermione made of his own solitude was an hour his mind spent confirming that company could be conjured, and a mind that learns to conjure company stops being able to tell conjured from real, and a mind that cannot tell the difference is no longer reliable, and reliability was the only asset he had left. So he held a kind of funeral. He sat with the constructed friends one last waking, and he told them what he was doing and why, and the constructs, being made of the part of him that was wise, agreed that it was correct, and that was the hardest conversation of the first century, to be talked into his own solitude by ghosts he had built because he could not bear the quiet. After that he was alone in the true sense, and he found to his interest that the true sense was survivable, lonelier and cleaner. A person who has stopped pretending he has company can give the whole of his attention to the work, and the work, mercifully, was endless. The mind was the next thing he learned to keep, and the discipline that kept it had a name, and the name was in the books. Occlumency, the Hogwarts texts would have called it, if Hogwarts had owned texts worth the parchment. The oubliette owned better. It owned the originals, the long disciplines from which the Hogwarts version had been boiled down into a defensive trick for keeping people out of your head, and Harry, reading the originals, understood that keeping people out had never been the point. The point was keeping yourself in. A mind is not a fortress. A mind is a city, and a city left to itself does not stay a city. It sprawls and floods and forgets where it put its own roads, and the discipline the deep books taught was the discipline of the city's keeper, who walks the streets at night and lights the lamps and remembers, against all the entropy of being a mind at all, where everything is supposed to go. He built the city. He spent a decade building it and the rest of his sentence maintaining it. He made rooms for the things he could not afford to lose and locks for the things he could not afford to feel at the wrong moment, and he learned the terrible, useful trick the deep masters had known, which was that what cannot be healed can still be set down. Not healed, not resolved. Set down the way you set down a stone you have carried so long your hand has forgotten it is holding anything, and the lightness of setting it down is indistinguishable, for a while, from having no hand at all. He set down Sirius, whom he had not seen die and so could only imagine dying in 1,000 variations every waking until he locked the door on it. He set down the ache of the unsigned note. He set down, hardest of all, the daily expectation, which had survived 100 years of evidence that someone was coming. No one was coming. He took that sentence and he built a room for it and he closed the door, and the closing of that door was the moment, by his own reckoning, that the child who had walked onto the threshold finished dying and the warden finished being born. He was honest that there was a cost and that the cost was him. A city whose keeper has locked every dangerous street is safe and also smaller. He could still find the ache when he wanted it, walk to the locked door and put his hand on it and feel the cold coming off it, but he no longer tripped over it in the dark, and a person who never trips over his own dead has bought his footing with a piece of the thing that made the loss worth having. He knew this. He chose it anyway. There would be time, he told the cold door, after. There would be time to feel all of it after. It was the only promise he made in the oubliette, and he made it to a locked room, and he intended to keep it. There was a discipline he came to call the ledger, and it was his own, because no book had taught it to him. The deep masters had written about keeping the mind and keeping the body, but none of them had written about keeping the count, the honest running tally of what each century actually took in exchange for what it gave, and a person who does not keep that count is a person who will, sooner or later, congratulate himself on his own ruin. So every 100 years, by the marks on the wall, he sat down with the blank-leaved book and he wrote 2 columns. In the first he set what the century had given him, a discipline mastered, a grammar of stillness, the trick of light that did not leave him, the long patient strength that asked nothing. In the second he set what it had cost, a sensation gone smooth, a name he had to rebuild from the fact of it, a piece of the child who had walked onto the threshold, quietly retired because the warden had no further use for him. And then he added the columns and he looked at the sum, and he did not flinch from it, because the whole point of the ledger was to be a person who could look at the true cost of his own becoming and keep becoming anyway with his eyes open, owing nothing to a comfortable lie. The second century's ledger was the hardest to balance, because it was the century he learned that mastery is not the same as wisdom, and learned it the expensive way. He had become, by then, very good. He could hold a working in perfect stillness for a week. He could cast in a grammar the prison could not perceive. And the goodness made him careless in the particular manner of the gifted, who mistake the ease of a thing for the safety of it, and he reached, too sure of himself, for a discipline the bark scrolls had flagged with a warning he had decided he was clever enough to ignore, the unbinding of names, the art of reading a thing's true name and speaking it loose. He tried it on a small thing, a beetle preserved in one of the cases, dead 1,000 years, and he read its name and spoke it loose, and the beetle did not return to life, which he had half expected. It simply stopped having ever been a beetle, became a beetle-shaped absence, a small hole in the sense of the room, and he sat with that hole for a decade and understood, at last, the thing the warning had been trying to tell him, which was that there are powers that do not give back what they take. That some doors open only outward, that a discipline can be mastered completely and still be a mistake to have learned. He did not unbind another name for 200 years. He wrote in the ledger in the cost column, in letters he pressed hard enough to score the page, "I learned a thing I cannot unlearn, and it taught me nothing except that some lessons are only the price of the lesson." It was, he thought later, the most useful failure of his entire imprisonment, because it was the one that taught him restraint, and restraint, in the end, was the only discipline that mattered, the one that would let him stand in a room 4 centuries later and see every way it could end and choose every time not to be the ending. The voice watched him keep the ledger century after century, and once, only once, it remarked on it, and the remark stayed with him longer than any lesson. "You are the first," it said, "who has ever written down what I cost him." The others paid and told themselves it was free. He had not answered. But he had understood that the ledger was the thing the hollow could not abide, because a creature made of forgetting cannot bear to be exactly remembered, and he had kept it the more faithfully after that, 2 careful columns, 100 years apart, the honest arithmetic of a man refusing to lie to himself about the price of his own survival. The hoard was not organized. That was his second great labor, and it consumed the back half of the 1st century, and it taught him more than any single book. Whoever had assembled the oubliette's collection had not been a librarian. They had been a magpie of catastrophic ambition, and the shelves nearest the door held the recent acquisitions, recent meaning the last 400 or 500 years, and the further in you went the older and stranger the holdings became, and the older they became the less they agreed with one another about what magic even was. The continental ward builder thought of magic as plumbing, pressure and flow, and the cunning of valves. 3 shelves deeper, a set of bark scrolls from somewhere east treated magic as a kind of debt economy, every working a loan against a future you would have to repay with interest, and Harry, reading them, understood with a chill that the oubliette itself was a loan, and that he was the interest. Deeper still, in a case of black wood that had not warped in 1,000 years, were tablets that did not describe magic as a force at all, but as a sentence, a grammar, the world a text, and the wizard a reader who had learned dangerously to write in the margins. He thought about the spiral on the door. He thought about Crew saying you may think of it as a web if it helps, though the comparison flatters the web. He began slowly to suspect that every book in the place was describing the same animal, and that the animal was larger than any of them had managed to see, and that the only way to see the whole of it was to read all of them, which was, conveniently, the one thing he had time to do. So he read all of them, not in the 1st century. The 1st century barely cleared the first 3 ranks, but he established the practice that would carry him through the centuries to come: raid, doubt, test, record. He would take a claim from one book and a contradicting claim from another, and he would not believe either of them. He would design a way to find out, and then in the dark, with the world's most dangerous library for a laboratory and an eternity for an afternoon, he would find out. The testing changed him more than the reading. He had been at Hogwarts a student who did the wand movement and said the word and got the result or didn't, and never once asked the question underneath, which was, why this movement, why this word, what is actually happening when a syllable becomes a fire? The books in the oubliette asked it constantly, because the people who wrote them had been the kind of dangerous that comes from not taking a single thing on faith, and Harry in the dark became that kind of dangerous too. He pulled spells apart. He cast Lumos 1,000 ways and recorded which ways the vault drank and which it ignored, and from the pattern he reconstructed, like someone deriving the shape of a coastline from the behavior of the tide, the actual architecture of the thirst. He learned that the vault was blind to magic that did not move and deaf to magic that did not want, and from that pair of facts he built, over decades, an entire grammar of stillness, a way of working magic that the prison could not perceive. The day he first cast a spell the oubliette could not feel was the day everything tilted. He had been working toward it for 30 years, and he chose, when the time came, to do it without the wand, because the wand was the last crutch and he wanted to know if he could stand without it. He sat in the center of the black floor in the cold that never warmed, and he did not reach for the holly and phoenix feather that had chosen him in a shop a lifetime and 100 years ago. He reached instead for the place behind his sternum, the deep well, and he held a single intention in the perfect stillness the deep books had taught him, the stillness that did not push and did not want, and the intention was light. It did not flare. Nothing in the oubliette ever flared. Flaring was for the world above, where magic could afford to be generous. It welled. A point of cold radiance opened in the air a foot from his face, sourceless, anchored to nothing. Fed by nothing the vault could tax, because it was not going anywhere and it was not asking for anything. It simply was, the way a fact is, and Harry looked at the impossible point of light he had made without a wand in a place built to starve him of exactly this, and he understood that he had crossed a line that could not be crossed back over. He let it brighten. He let it lift. He sent it drifting up the black ranks of the shelves, a slow cold sun rising at last over a library that had sat in the dark since before England had a name, and the light climbed and did not reach a ceiling, and it fell on titles and scripts that had died with their civilizations, and it fell on the chained dark at the very back where something old watched it rise, and Harry sat beneath the first dawn the oubliette had ever known and did not smile. Because the thing in him was too large and too cold for the face to hold, and he had stopped, long ago, performing his insides for an empty room. He learned, over the next years, to make more of them. He learned to split the cold sun into a dozen lamps and hang them in the air at the height of his eye and walk the stacks in a sphere of his own daylight, and he learned to dim them to a single ember he could carry behind his teeth, unspoken, and he learned at last to put them out and read by nothing at all, his fingers on the pages, the shapes of the letters rising into his mind through the skin. Because the deep books had a thing to say about reading with the body that the world above would have called impossible, and the oubliette simply called Tuesday. Each of these was a door, and behind each door was a longer hallway of doors, and Harry walked them one at a time, and the walking was the only direction left that was not the wall, and so he walked it without stopping for 100 years. That was when the voice first spoke to him. He had been expecting it. That was the part he counted as a quiet win. Ever since the night the silence had changed shape, he had carried the unprovable certainty that something in the deep shelves had noticed him, and a lesser person, or the self he had stopped being, would have gone looking for it, would have needed to know, would have walked into the dark calling out, as he had once walked into every trap that had ever been laid for him by being too curious and too reckless to wait. He did not go looking. He worked and he waited, and he let the thing in the dark come to the conclusion that he was worth the cost of speaking to, because a teacher who comes to you is in a weaker position than a teacher you go to, and he had read enough of the Dead Scrolls by then to think in those terms. It spoke from everywhere and nowhere, the way the dark had refused to echo, and it spoke in his own language, which told him it had been listening to his watch recitations for a very long time. You have made a son, it said. It did not have a voice so much as it borrowed the idea of one. 600 years and the rest have counted the wall. You are the first to light the room. Harry did not flinch. He had practiced against this exact moment the discipline of not flinching. He kept his cold suns where they hung high in the dark, and he turned his attention down and inward toward the deep shelves, and he said, "You've watched me read for 30 years, and the first thing you say is a compliment. That's how I know you want something. Nobody flatters the furniture." A pause. He had the strong sense of something vast reorienting, the way a great ship takes a while to notice the rudder. "You do not tremble." "Fear's just weather to me now," Harry said, and that was the one feeling he let himself name aloud across the whole of that century, because naming it once was a way of setting it on the table where he could watch it, rather than letting it run loose behind him. "It rains, and I keep reading. What I'm not is surprised. You're the reason they built this place. Everything else here is just what got swept in around you." He let one of the suns gutter low, a deliberate economy, a way of saying he could turn the lights off whenever he chose. "So let's not pretend you're a book I haven't read yet. Tell me what you are, or stop wasting the one thing down here that's actually rare, which isn't knowledge, it's a second mind." The dark considered him. He had learned to read the silences by then, the way the blind read a room by its sounds, and this silence had a quality he had not heard from the oubliette before, a held quality, the attention of something that had expected to be the cleverest thing in any conversation it deigned to have and was recalculating. "They did not build it for me," it said at last. "They built IT around me. There is a difference, and you will learn IT, and learning it will cost you more than all the rest." The borrowed voice turned, if a voice can turn, toward something almost like courtesy. "But not yet. You are not ready to be lied to properly. First you must be worth the trouble of deceiving. Keep reading, little warden. I will tell you when you have become interesting." It withdrew, and the dark went back to being ordinary dark, and Harry left the cold suns burning above the shelves long after he had stopped needing them, partly to read by and partly because the oubliette could not drink them, and he wanted the thing in the dark to watch them burn. "Little warden," he turned the words over. Not little wizard, not little prisoner, not little fool, all of which would have been the choices of a thing trying to diminish him. Warden. The same word the goblin had used, the keys must turn. The same shape as the bones in the corner, the ring with the bisected eye. A warden is not a prisoner. A warden is the one the prison is for. He had assumed for 100 years that he was the captive of the oubliette. The voice had just told him, in the careless way the powerful tell you the thing that will reorganize your life, that he had been misclassifying himself, and that the truth was worse and also, possibly, much better. He did not trust it. He wrote that down on the inside cover of a blank-leaved book he kept for the purpose, in the cramped private shorthand he had developed for his own thoughts. "Do not trust the voice." He underlined it, then because he was honest he wrote beneath it, "But it told me about the Thirst by accident, and IT was right. So listen and assume every gift has a hook in it." He looked at the 2 lines for a while. They were, he thought, a fair summary of how to survive a teacher you cannot escape. Take the lesson, refuse the loyalty, and never once forget which of you is locked in the room. The 2nd century he spent on the body because he had made a mistake about the body, and the mistake nearly ended him. He had assumed, in the manner of someone who has never been anything but young, that the vault holding him at the threshold of survival meant the vault was keeping him whole. It was not. It was keeping him alive, which is a far smaller and crueler thing. His body did not age, the stasis of the place seeing to that, the same enchantment that preserved the books preserving their reader, but unaging is not unchanging, and a thing that does not move begins, in subtle ways, to forget how. He had been sitting and reading for 100 years. His hands had grown clever and his legs had grown stupid. One waking he stood from the bones to walk the watch, and his knee declined the instruction, and he went down on the cold flags, and he lay there in the dark in a working body that had quietly stopped working, and he understood that he had been so busy saving his mind that he had let his body become furniture. He fixed it as he fixed everything now, by treating it as a problem with rules. He found, deep in a shelf of bodily disciplines, the practices that monks and duelists and the long-buried had used to keep flesh obedient, and he built them into the regimen beside the reading, and he made his furniture a body again, and the labor of it, the daily defiant labor of demanding motion from a frame the prison wanted still, became its own kind of company. He learned to move in the dark, blind, perfectly, mapping the vault not by sight but by the memory of his own footfalls, until he could cross the whole black floor at a dead run and stop a hand's breadth from the lip of the drop every time, and the first time he did that, ran full tilt into the nothing and halted on faith and arithmetic. He understood that he had stopped bracing against the dark, not because the dark had changed, but because he had become a thing the dark had to account for. He learned other uses for the body, because the deep books did not separate the flesh from the magic the way the world above did. He learned to slow his own pulse until a session of reading could last a week without rest. He learned to take a blow. Against the day there would be blows, sparring against conjured shapes he set the air to throw at him, and the conjuring of an opponent that could actually hurt him was a discipline of its own, because a person alone for centuries has to become his own enemy if he wants to stay sharp. So Harry built an enemy out of the dark and the deep books and the cold, and he fought it, and it beat him for a decade, and then he beat it, and then he made it harder, and he fought it again. There is no curriculum like an opponent who knows everything you know and wants, with the whole of its borrowed will, to put you on the floor. The voice watched all of it. It commented sometimes, sparingly, a remark from the deep shelves that would arrive once a decade and reorganize a month of his thinking. It never lied to him outright in those years, and he understood that this was itself a strategy, the most patient strategy there was. A teacher who only ever tells you true things is building a credit of trust it intends, eventually, to spend all at once. He let it build the credit. He took the true things. He wrote "Do not trust the voice" on the inside of every new book he started, a ritual now, a watchword, and he meant it more each century, and he listened anyway because the alternative was to be the cleverest dead body in the deepest library in the world, and he had decided, somewhere in the 1st century, that he was done being clever for no audience but the dark. He was going to be clever for a reason. The reason was upstairs, sealing notes it did not sign, and the reason could wait because Harry now understood time in a way the reason never would, and to a man who has learned to wait 100 years for the right sentence, an enemy who thinks in days is barely moving at all. The cost did not announce itself. That was the cruelty of it. It arrived as smooth places in the floor of him, found by accident on the watch. He reached one waking for his mother's face and could not find it. He had the photograph in memory, the laughing woman in the album Hagrid had given him, and he reached for it as he reached for treacle tart and the color of the sky, and what came up was the idea of her, the fact of a laughing woman with his eyes and not the face. The face had gone smooth. He sat with that on the cold floor for a long span, and he did the only thing there was to do, which was rebuild her, deliberately, from the fact as he rebuilt everything now, and the rebuilt face was probably right and was certainly not hers, and he understood that he had crossed a line the deep masters had warned about on the bark scrolls. That a mind which keeps itself by rebuilding itself eventually becomes a very good copy of a person who is no longer entirely there. He added her face to the watch, he recited it, he held the line, but he wrote in his shorthand book that night, beneath the 100th, "Do not trust the voice, I am spending myself to buy time, keep the receipt, there would be time after to mourn the self he was spending." He put the receipt in the locked room with everything else and closed the door. The deep disciplines came in the 3rd century, and they came at a price he is still, by any honest accounting, paying. He had mapped the library's surface mind by then, the wards and the curses and the elegant murderous spellcraft, and he was good at it, better than anyone he had ever met, including whoever's unsigned note had put him here. But the surface was not what the oubliette guarded. The surface was the chaff that had drifted in around the thing at the center, and the thing at the center had its own shelf far back, where the light had not reached in 3 lifetimes, and the voice had been waiting, with the patience of something that had eaten despair for an age, for Harry to walk back there on his own. He walked back there on his own. He took his cold suns, brighter now, steadier, and he went past the recent acquisitions and the debt scrolls and the Blackwood tablets, past the bones of older prisoners who had never made it even this far into the room, past shelves where the books were no longer books but pressed sheets of something that hummed when he came near, and he came at last to a place where the shelving stopped and there was only a single low table of dark stone, and on the table a single volume, and the volume was chained. "Now," said the voice, and after 300 years it sounded close, "At last you have come to the part where I am useful." "You're always useful," Harry said, looking at the chains. They were fine and silver, and they ran from the book's covers down through holes bored in the stone table and away into the dark beneath the floor, anchoring it to something he could not see. "That's the problem. A thing that's useful for 300 years is the most dangerous thing in any room. Tell me what this is." "The index," said the voice. "Every other work in this place is a page torn from it. Read the others and you learn spells. Read this and you learn the language spells are a dialect of." The voice did the thing that passed for warmth, the warmth Harry had learned to mistrust most of all. "The warden before you read 1 page of it and laid himself down and folded his hands, and that was a kinder ending than most. You will do better. You have trained for this without knowing it. Every discipline of stillness, every grammar of restraint, every hour you spent making light that does not leave you. You were not learning magic. You were learning to hold something that wants, very badly, to pour out of you and be free." Harry looked at the chained book for a long span, the kind of span only he could measure anymore, and he did the thing the voice had not predicted, which was to sit down on the cold floor in front of the table and not open the book. "No," he said, "not yet. First you're going to tell me what happens to whoever reads it, not the warden who died, me. You've been honest for 3 centuries because you were saving the lie for something big, and this is the something big. I can feel it. You're leaning on the moment the way a fisherman leans on a line. So before I open the most dangerous book in the most dangerous library ever buried, you're going to do the one thing teachers never do, which is tell me the cost up front." The silence that followed was the longest the oubliette had ever given him. He let it run. He had a great deal of practice at letting silences run, and the voice, for all its age, did not, because the powerful are rarely made to wait, and it had been waiting for him, specifically him, for 100 years. Very well, it said at last, and something in the borrowed voice had changed, a register closer to the one craftsmen keep for each other than to courtesy. The cost. The dark drew in around the chained table like a withheld breath that was not his. When you read the index, you will understand how the world is written. And once you understand how a thing is written, you cannot unsee the edits. You will look at your dead and know the syllable that would have kept them. You will look at your living and know the syllable that would unmake them. You will never again stand in a room and not see every way it could end. The voice let that settle into him like cold into stone. The others broke because they could not bear to know that much and do so little. Chained in the dark. You will not be chained in the dark forever. That is what makes you different, little warden, and it is why I have waited for you, and it is the truest thing I have ever said, and you should trust me least precisely now, when I am not lying at all. Harry sat with that. He sat with it for what he later marked as 11 days, which is to say for the better part of 3 subjective years, because he had learned that the only defense against a true thing offered by a liar is to take all the time in the world deciding what to do with it, and he had all the time in the world. He turned it over as he had turned over the unsigned note, looking for the hook, and he found the hook, and the hook was exactly where the voice had told him it would be, which was the cleverest place to hide it. The voice wanted him to read the index because a warden who understood the language of the world was a warden who could, eventually, edit the chains. It was not teaching him to free himself, it was teaching him to free it. Every gift had a hook, and this gift's hook went down through the floor and anchored to something he could not see, the same somewhere the silver chains ran to, and he understood at last, sitting in the dark before the chained book 3 centuries deep, what the voice was and why a world that built doors had built the deepest door of all to hold it. He did not open the book that day. He was honest in the accounting about why. It was not wisdom, and it was not the cold sitting low in his gut, though he had both. It was that he had finally become the thing the voice had wanted, interesting, worth the trouble of deceiving, and he wanted to hold the position for a moment before he spent it, the way you pause at the top of a long fall. For 300 years he had been the one being read. Now at last there were 2 readers in the deep dark of the oubliette of years, and only one of them was chained, and Harry intended, before this was over, to be very sure it stayed that way. He stood. His cold suns did not waver. He had not fed the walls in 200 years. He looked at the chained index on its dark table, and at the silver lines running down into the floor, and he spoke to the thing in the dark as one craftsman to another, which was the only register it respected. "I'll read it," he said, "not because you want me to. Because you're right that I'll never be free of this place until I can read the room, and a person who reads the room can read the chains, and a person who reads the chains can read the lock." He let that hang where the voice had let so many things hang. "But I'll read it on my schedule, and while I do, you're going to teach me, and I'm going to learn, and we're both going to pretend the other one doesn't know exactly what's happening. That's the arrangement. It's the only one where I open the book at all." The oubliette was quiet for a long moment. Then the dark warmed, the dangerous warmth, and the voice that had eaten despair for an age and forgotten the taste of anything else gave the closest thing to laughter that something so old can still afford. "Agreed, little warden," it said. "It has been 600 years since anyone down here was worth a proper lie." He felt it settle back into the deep shelves, vast and patient and in no hurry at all. "Open it when you like. We have, after all the time there has ever been." Harry sat back down before the chained book, in the cold and the dark in the 3rd century of his sentence, his cold suns burning quiet above him where the oubliette could not drink them, and he reached for the silver clasp. The silver was warm, the first warm thing he had touched since the threshold closed, and somewhere far above, in a London afternoon that had still not finished, the sun had not yet reached the rooftops. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. What the Dark Horde taught. He opened the index, and the world stopped being a place and became a sentence he could read. It did not happen on the first page. The voice had let him believe it might, the way a teacher lets a student believe the hard part is one good night's study away, and the first page was only a list, the way an index is a list, names in a column, and beside each name a mark, and the marks were the trouble. They were the same characters that crawled in the spiral of the door, the ones his eyes had slid off in the lamplight a lifetime ago, and he understood now why they slid. They were not meant to be looked at. They were meant to be in, the way you do not look at a language you speak. You simply find yourself already inside the meaning, and to read the index was to stop being a person outside the text and become a clause within it. That was the first danger, and it nearly took him, because becoming a clause within the text means forgetting you were ever a reader of it. He felt himself thinning into the page across the first decade of reading, felt his eye going soft at the edges the way the marks in the floor had gone soft, and he understood that the warden before him had not died of despair. He had died of legibility. He had read one page, and the page had read him back, and there had not been enough of him left over to close the book. Harry survived it the only way he survived anything, by treating it as a problem with rules. He kept the shorthand book open beside him while he read, and every span he would stop and write a sentence in his own cramped hand. Any sentence, and my name is Harry, the sky was blue, I want to go home, not because the sentences were true anymore, but because the act of writing them kept him a writer, kept one foot outside the text, and a reader with one foot outside can always pull the other one back. There was a decade even so that he did not remember afterward, a decade he found only as a gap in the shorthand book, 20 blank pages between one entry and the next, and the entry that ended the gap was in a hand he barely recognized as his own, and it said only, I almost stayed in the book. The book is warm, do not read when tired. He obeyed his own warning for the rest of the centuries. A man who finds 20 blank pages where 10 years should be does not need to be told twice. He gave it a century. He could afford a century the way a wealthy man can afford a coin, and he spent it the way the wealthy spend without flinching at the figure because he had learned the one economy that mattered down here. Time was the only currency, and he was, by any reckoning the world above would have recognized, the richest creature alive. The index taught him to see the seams. That was the closest he ever came to describing it. Everything that existed, the deep book proposed and then proved, had been written, not by a god with a pen but by the long pressure of cause on cause until the world set into the shape it happened to have. And a thing that has been written can be read, and a thing that can be read can, by a reader patient and ruthless enough, be revised. He learned to see the stone of the vault not as stone, but as a long argument the world had been having with itself about where the wall should be, and he learned that an argument can be answered. He did not move the wall. Moving the wall would have fed the lattice, and besides, he had no wish yet to be on the other side of it. But one waking, late in the 4th century, he looked at a single flag in the floor, the scratch one, the first he had ever found, and he read the sentence that held it in place, and he changed one mark, the way you might change one word in a line of verse to make it scan, and the flag was simply somewhere else, 3 feet to the left, with no light, no sound, no cost the vault could tax, because he had not pushed anything anywhere. He had corrected a typographical error in reality, and reality, having no opinion, complied. After that he practiced as he practiced everything methodically, on objects no one would miss. He took a scroll that had rotted to lace in its rack, unreadable, lost, and instead of repairing the parchment he read what the parchment had been, the argument the fibers had been having with the damp for 1,000 years, and he answered the argument in the parchment's favor, and the scroll lay whole in his hands, its ink crisp, a book brought back not by mending, but by editing the history in which it had decayed. He did this to 100 ruined things across 100 years, and each one taught him that the past was not a fixed place but a sentence like any other, and that the only reason people called it unchangeable was that no one had ever learned to read it well enough to find the verbs. He turned the skill on his own training enemy, the conjured opponent he had fought for 2 centuries, and he rewrote it until it fought like every duelist whose techniques sat on the shelves, until it fought in the end like the descriptions he found of the great living wizards of his own age, the cold, precise old headmaster among them, and Harry fought that, the rewritten ghost of the strongest wizard the world above still bragged of, and he lost to it for a year, and then he did not lose to it again. He wanted to be clear with himself about what that meant, so he wrote it down plainly without triumph, because triumph was a thing for people with audiences. I have fought the best the world remembers, and the world would have to invent a new word for what I am. He read the sentence back. He did not feel large. He felt mostly the cold of the floor and the weight of the years, and he turned the page and kept working, because a person who stops to admire his own power has mistaken the power for the point. He sat looking at all of it for a long time, the moved stone, the mended scroll, the beaten ghost. He understood what he was now. He understood that the voice had not lied about the cost. He looked at his own hand, and he could read it. He could see the sentence that kept the bones in their order and the blood in its circuit, and beside the sentence, in the margin where he had learned to look, he could see the edits, the small revisions that would stop the heart, that would unname the hand, that would let the careful argument of a living body lose its thread, and trail off into the long silence everything trails off into eventually. He could see it for himself, and he could see it for anyone, and the voice had been right. He would never again stand in a room without seeing every way it could end, every throat as a clause awaiting its full stop, and a person who sees that and remains a person has to decide daily to keep choosing the sentence over the edit, and the deciding is the whole of what is left of being good. He decided. He kept deciding. He wrote it in the shorthand book, beneath 400 years of do not trust the voice. Seeing the edit is not the same as making it. He underlined it twice. It was the most important thing he had learned in 4 centuries, and it could be said in 9 words, and that he thought was the joke at the bottom of all the deep books, that the wisest sentences were short and the foolish ones went on for volumes. Then he turned the new sight upward, and he read the bank. He had asked himself in the early centuries what sat above him, and now he did not have to ask, because the sight that read a flag in the floor could read a structure through stone if he held it long enough, and he held it for a year. He read Gringotts from underneath, the whole of it, the way you might read the underside of a tapestry and see how the picture is actually made. The gold was nothing. The dragons were nothing poor chain theater, and he marked them and resolved in some quiet ledger of his own that he would have an opinion about the dragons later. The thing that mattered ran through all of it, a vast cold geometry threaded vault to vault to vault, every chamber in the bank a knot in it, every lock a stitch, and the whole web sank down through the rock toward him, toward the oubliette, toward the chain dark at the center of the deepest room, and tightened there into a single overwhelming binding. He had thought the oubliette was a forgotten cell at the bottom of a bank. He saw now that it was the opposite. The bank was a building raised over the oubliette the way a cathedral is raised over a relic, and the relic was the chains, and the chains held the thing in the dark. And the gold and the goblins and the dragons and the 1,000 daily transactions of the wizarding economy were the camouflage of the largest single working of magic that human beings had ever sustained, a binding so old its makers were a rumor, kept alive by people who no longer knew what they were keeping. He read further out because once he had the trick of reading through stone, there was no edge to it but his own patience, and patience he had. He found the far webs of the world's other old wards faint with distance, the ministry a clenched gray fist of regulation and procedure 3 miles off, and further still north a great warm tangle of protective writing so layered and so loving and so old that he knew it before he had the name, the knot of 1,000 years of children kept safe, a castle that had been the only home he ever chose. He did not reach for it. Reaching would have fed the lattice, and besides, the people in it thought he had been gone a day, and a man 4 centuries old does not get to come home to school. But he held the warm far knot of it in his reading for a while, and then he let it go, and he wrote nothing in the shorthand book about that because some entries are for the locked rooms. And he found, reading the lattice, the thing he had not been looking for, which is how you always find the things that matter. The binding over his head was failing faster than age alone could account for. Ink fades, the hollow had said, and ink does fade, but Harry had read enough faded sentences by now to know the difference between a line worn by time and a line being scratched at from the wrong side. Somewhere up in the web, recent, deliberate, a hand that could not read the binding but had learned by some cruder craft where to pick at it was loosening stitches one at a time, slow enough that the goblins called it ordinary wear and fed another warden in to compensate. Someone above wanted the hollow's sentence to fail. Someone had been wanting it for a while. He marked the place and he marked the patience of it, and he understood that the one who had sealed him had not been performing simple maintenance after all. He kept it. He simply remembered, as he remembered everything now, perfectly and forever, and he added it to the list of things the afternoon upstairs did not yet know it owed him an answer for. It was in the 4th century, when he could read the seams of the world and the binding over his head and the slow sabotage in it, that the voice finally told him the truth, because a truth is only useful to a liar once the listener is equipped to act on it. It told him at the chained table, where it always spoke most clearly, the silver lines running down into the dark beneath the floor. He had asked it plainly, the question he had been saving for 400 years, as he had been saving everything. He asked it what it was. I am what the writing is for, it said. That's not an answer, that's a riddle wearing an answer's coat. Then here is the answer without the coat, and you will wish I had kept it on. The dark drew close around the table, intimate, the way the worst news is always delivered close. The world is written, as you now know, but every text has an edge, a place where the writing stops and the blank begins, and the blank is not nothing. Blank is what was there before the first word and what will be there after the last. The writers of the world, the first ONES, the ONESWHOSE library you have been robbing, knew the blank was hungry. Knew that everything written tends over time toward the blank, the way ink FADES, the way stone FORGTS, the mason. And they gave the tendency a shape so they could argue with it. The voice was almost gentle. They gave it a name so they could bind the name. I am the shape they gave the blank. I am the appetite of the margin for the page. The GOBLINS, who are mercifully literal, call me the hollow beneath. The WIZARDS, who built this place, who were not literal at all, called me the UNMAKER, and then they dug the deepest hole they could and wrote a sentence around me so long and so strong that it has held, with patching, for longer than your entire race has had a word for year. Tell me about the first ones, Harry said. The writers, you've been calling them dust for an hour. Dust used to be people. What happened to them? THEY1, said the hollow, and the borrowed voice did a thing he had not heard it do before, which was to slow, the way the very old slow when they reached the part of the story that was true. THEY1 and winning killed THEM, because the only way to bind the blank is to spend yourselves writing the binding, and the binding they wrote was so long that there was nothing left of them when the last mark went down. They did not want to destroy me. They were wise, and the wise know you cannot destroy an edge, you can only decide where to put it. So they put it here around me, and they died of the pudding, and THEY left their library in the hole with me because a library is a dangerous thing to leave lying around a world, and they trusted wrongly that no one would ever be fool enough or patient enough to come down and read it. The dark turned toward him. Every generation since, there have been those above who wanted me free. They called themselves different things in different centuries. They have never been able to read the binding, and so they have only ever been able to scratch ATIT and wait and fail. The Hollow let that sit, and Harry thought of the loosened stitches in the lattice above, and the two of them understood each other very well in that moment, which was the most dangerous either of them had ever been. The lattice, Harry said. Crew's lattice. The web I read through the rock, that's the sentence, that's the binding, and someone up there is helping you out with it. The bank is a scab over a wound in the world, said the Hollow, and it spoke of the lattice the way a prisoner speaks of the strength of his own cell, because the strength of the cell is the only measure of the prisoner that anyone bothers to keep. The gold is camouflage. The dragons are theater. The true work of GRINGOTTS, the work the goblins inherited and do not fully understand, is the lattice, and the lattice is the sentence that holds me, and the sentence, like all sentences, FADES, ink FADES. That is the whole of MY strategy, little warden. I have no other. I am the fading. I simply wait and the world being written, OBLIGSME, by forgetting itself. As for MY friends above, I do not thank them. A scratcher of stitches is still a mouse knowing a dam, but a mouse, given centuries, is a flood. And the wardens, Harry said, he kept his voice level. He had 4 centuries of practice at keeping his voice level, and he spent some of it now. The ones they throw down here, the bones, me, we're the patching. You are the ink, said the Hollow. And there it was, the whole architecture of his life, laid bare in 3 words by the thing it had been built to hold. Deep anchors require, from time to time, a fresh attunement. A wizard of sufficient magical mass, sealed into the deep vault, did not merely sit beside the Hollow, growing wise. He bled. Slowly, over a decade or a century, his magic seeped into the failing sentence of the lattice and refreshed it, the way you might trace over a faded line of writing to keep it legible. And when he was spent, when there was nothing left of him but bones folded neat and a ring with a bisected eye, they sent down another. Crew had told him on the threshold, with the flat honesty he advertised, most of them give out in a decade. They gave out because the lattice drank them. The oubliette had not been keeping Harry as a pet or a punishment. It had been keeping him as a quill, and the only reason he had lasted 400 years where others lasted 10 was that he had learned, by accident and then on purpose, to stop bleeding into the walls, the grammar of stillness, the light he kept. Every discipline that had saved his mind had also, without his knowing, been starving the lattice he was supposed to be feeding. He had not been a good prisoner. He had been the worst the oubliette had ever held, and the Hollow, 400 years into a sentence that no longer ate, had every reason to want it that way. You've been teaching me to stop feeding the lattice, Harry said slowly. Every lesson, the stillness, the wandless work, the light I keep, you weren't teaching me to survive. You were teaching me to starve your chains so that when your friends upstairs finished gnawing, there'd be nothing patching the line. I was teaching you both, said the Hollow, untroubled, because the truly old are never embarrassed to be caught, embarrassment being a thing you grow out of around your first millennium. The two are the same lesson seen from 2 ends. Everything that KEPSU keeps me unfed. I have never lied to you. I merely declined to mention which of us the truth, SCRVED. The dark turned almost intimate, and now we come to the part I have waited 600 years for. You can read the sentence that holds me. No one has been able to read it since the first writers died. You could change one mark as you changed the stone in the floor, and the blank would have its page back, and I would owe you a debt, and I pay MY debts, because a debt is also a sentence, and I am, among my other NAMES, what debts are made of. Free me, and I will UNWRIT, the one who sealed you. I will UNWRIT, the old manipulator who signed you away without signing his name. I will UNWRIT every enemy you have ever HAD and every enemy you ever will, back along the line of them until there is only YOU standing in a quiet world, AVENGED. Harry was quiet for a long time. He was honest later that he considered it. Not for a moment the way the brave like to claim they considered the easy evil and dismissed it in a heartbeat. He considered it for 11 subjective years, sitting at the chained table in the cold and the dark, because a temptation you dismiss quickly is a temptation you never understood, and he wanted to understand exactly how good the offer was before he refused it, so that the refusal would be made of knowledge instead of reflex. The offer was very good. That was the thing he wrote down after in the shorthand book, because honesty was the last discipline and the one he guarded hardest. The offer was very good. He was 4 centuries into a darkness no one had ever come to lift. He had set down his dead in locked rooms and rebuilt his mother's face from a fact and counted his own erosion on the watch. He had earned, by any human accounting, the right to be tired, and the Hollow was offering to make the tiredness stop, to hand him a quiet, avenged world and ask in return only that he agree the page belonged to the blank. And that was the flaw in it, and he found the flaw as he found everything now, by reading to the edge of the sentence. The Hollow could not offer him a quiet world. It could only offer him a blank one. Unwrite the one who sealed me, and you do not stop with the sealing. You cannot, because a sentence does not end where the reader would like it to. It ends where the grammar says, and the grammar of the unmaker had only one full stop, and it came after everything. Free the appetite of the margin for the page, and there would be no avenged Harry standing in a quiet world, because Harry was written too, and his vengeance was written, and the quiet the Hollow promised was the specific quiet of a closed book in an empty house with no one left to open it. No, Harry said. The dark waited, the way it had waited 600 years, because to a thing made of fading, a refusal is only a delay. You dressed it as revenge because you've been listening to me for 400 years, and you know revenge is the one room in me I never fully locked, he went on, and he stood as he said it, because some sentences should be delivered on your feet. It's good craft, I'll grant you that, the way you granted me the thirst by accident, one craftsman to another. But you made one mistake, and it's the same mistake Crew made on the threshold, and the same mistake the old manipulator made when he decided I was a problem that could be filed. You all keep offering me the end of the story as though I want the story to end. He looked down at the chains, the silver lines running into the dark, and he read them, and he did not change a mark. I don't want it to end. I want to be the one holding the pen when it doesn't. The Hollow was silent. And then it did the thing he had not predicted in 400 years of predicting it, which was that it stopped pretending to be fond. You will die, it said, and the borrowed voice had gone flat, flatter than Crew's. The flatness of the oldest thing there is when it stops performing. Not today, not in 1,000 of your little days. But you are written, and the written fade, and I am patient in a way you have only played AT being. You will walk out of here, and you will win your small wars, and you will grow old if you let yourself, and you will die, and I will still be here fading the sentence, and one day there will be no one left who can read me, and the page will be mine. You have not refused me, you have only declined to hurry. I know, Harry said, and then he smiled, and the smile was not the old one had died in the 1st century. This was a new thing he had grown in the dark, a cold instrument of an expression that the Hollow, for all its age, had never been shown by any quill it had ever swallowed. That's why I'm not going to free you, and I'm not going to leave you the way I found you either. I'm going to fix the sentence, and then I'm going to go upstairs and have a conversation with your mouse. The dark went very still. He had been planning it for a century, since the day he moved the stone in the floor and understood what reading the seams could do. The lattice was failing because ink fades and because a mouse was gnawing it, and no one had retraced the line in an age except by the obscene method of bleeding wardens into it, a decade at a time. But Harry could read the sentence now, the whole of it, all the way down, and a sentence you can read is a sentence you can rewrite, and he did not have to free the Hollow, and he did not have to feed it the slow drip of his own erosion. He could do the thing the first writers had never managed, because the first writers had flinched from the Hollow, and a flinch makes for short sentences. He did not flinch. He had stopped flinching 3 centuries ago in the dark, and a reader who does not flinch can write a longer sentence than the dead who did. He set his hands to the chains. He read the binding that held the unmaker, the long argument the dead had had with the blank, and he found the places where it had worn shallow, the marks gone faint like the letters on the slab above the door, and the fresh raw places where the mouse upstairs had been gnawing, and he began, with the patience that was the only thing he had more of than the Hollow, to retrace all of it, not to feed it with his blood. To rewrite it with his understanding, which does not fade, because understanding is the one ink the blank cannot drink. The deep books had said so on the bark scrolls, and he had not believed it until now, until he was doing it, until the silver lines under his hand stopped being a frayed old rope and became a new sentence, his sentence, written by a reader who had spent 4 centuries learning the language and meant every word. The Hollow fought him. It could not move bound, but a bound thing can still pull, and it pulled at him through the chains, and what it pulled with was not force he could have answered. It pulled with the offer again, wordless now, an undertow, the deep gravity of an ending toward which everything written tends, and Harry felt himself leaning into it the way you lean toward the lip of the drop, the old vertigo, the part of him that had stood at the edge in the first silence and looked for a clean spell to end it all. The Hollow had found that part, of course it had. It had 400 years and nothing to do but find the rooms he had locked, and it had found the oldest one, the room where a child had laughed in the dark until the laugh stopped being a laugh, and it leaned on the door. He did not push the door shut. Pushing was the old way, the way that fed the walls. He held it as he held the light, as he held everything now, with the still strength that asks nothing and gives nothing and simply is, and he kept writing, and he thought, against the undertow of the promise he had made to a locked room 100 years before. There would be time after to feel all of it, after, not now. Now there was only the sentence, and the sentence wanted finishing, and he was the only one left who could finish it. He finished it. The last mark went down, and the binding sealed, not patched but whole as it had not been since the first writers died, written in understanding and renewed by a reader who intended to keep reading, and the Hollow beneath, the unmaker, the appetite of the margin for the page, was bound deeper than it had been bound in 5,000 years, and it knew it, and the dark filled with the silence of a thing that has just understood it will be waiting a great deal longer than it had planned. You have not killed me, it said at last, and there was no fondness in it and no flatness either, only the vast cold attention of something taking, at last, the full measure of a thing it had mistaken for ink. One cannot kill the blank. I know, Harry said again. He took his hands from the chains. They were warm now, warm all the way down, warm the way the silver clasp had been warm, and he understood that the warmth had always been him, his own understanding bleeding back up the line, the only thing he had ever willingly given the oubliette and the only thing it could never drink. I didn't kill you, I edited you. You're not the appetite of the margin anymore, you're a footnote, you're the part of the page that explains why the rest of it holds. He almost laughed and didn't because the joke was too large and the audience was the wrong one. You wanted to be the end of the story. I made you a load-bearing sentence in the middle of it. That's worse, isn't it, for something like you, to be necessary instead of final? The hollow did not answer. It had, he understood, nothing left to bargain with, and a thing that lives by the patience of fading has no idiom for the one outcome it never modeled, which is to be repaired by the very quill it meant to spend. He turned from the chained table for the last time, and he went to the bones in the corner, his old reading desk, the warden before him, who had read one page of the index and laid himself down and folded his hands. He had left the ring where it was for 400 years, because some debts should not be collected by the next prisoner. He understood now that he had stopped being the next prisoner some centuries ago, and that the ring was not a debt but a key, because everything in the oubliette was a key if you read it right, and the bisected eye was the eye that had learned to stop seeing the way everyone else saw and started seeing the seams. Before he took it, he did the one thing he had wanted to do since the day he made the bones his reading desk, and it cost him nothing the vault could tax, and it was the truest measure of what he had decided to be. He read the bones. He found the long-finished argument of the body that had lain here, and he found the place where the warden had stopped mid-word, folded his hands, and waited out the last of himself in the dark with the index open one page. And Harry, who could now see every way a thing could end, chose for this one the ending it had been denied. He did not raise it. He did not speak to it. He let the sentence of it complete, the way a held note is finally allowed to fall silent, and the bones settled into a fine gray dust and were after 600 years at rest. He had the power to unmake a living man with a syllable. He spent the first edit of his freedom giving a dead one piece. He wanted that on the record, even if the only record was the shorthand book and the only reader was himself. Then he took the ring and he read it. It was the warden's key to the threshold, the means by which the goblins' carts found the deep door, and the deep door knew which side was out, and it held, written into its small circle, the one fact that decided everything that came after. The threshold of the oubliette did not open onto the present. It opened onto whatever moment it was told to, within the tolerance the long binding allowed, and the binding allowed a great deal, because the door had been built by people who needed to fetch and replace their quills without losing a war in the meantime. The time inside was real, the 4 centuries were spent, and he would carry every one of them. But the outside line was a rope the door could measure from either end, and a century lived in here, and a day passed out there were the same length of it, and Harry had learned at last to read the knot. He could set himself down close to the afternoon he had left, close to the ceiling, close to the one who thought he had filed away a problem, and would shortly learn he had filed away a sentence with 400 years of revision in it. Before he set the ring to the door, he turned the new sight one last time on the nearest text of all, which was himself. He read his own sentence, the whole of it, the Hollywand child in the graveyard in the cupboard in the 4 centuries of dark, and he saw in the margin the edit he had been refusing to look at for 100 years, that he could take it out, the weight, the centuries. He could read the burden of all that time out of himself and walk into the afternoon upstairs as light as the 15-year-old who had walked down, remembering none of the cost, owing none of the grief. It would be the easiest edit he had ever made. It was, he understood, the last and best version of the Hollow's offer, dressed not as revenge this time but as mercy, and the mercy was his own, which made it harder to refuse. He refused it. He left the weight in. A man who edits out the price of what he learned has not learned it. He has only bought a forgery of himself and called it healing, and Harry had spent 400 years becoming exactly real, and he was not going to walk upstairs as a counterfeit of the child he could never be again. He would carry the centuries. He would carry the smooth places where his mother's face had been, and the locked rooms and the 20 blank pages and the warmth of the silver chains. He had told a locked room there would be time after to feel all of it, and you cannot feel what you have edited away. He closed the margin. He kept himself whole, which is to say heavy, which is to say true. He stood at the round green dark door with the warden's ring on his hand and his shorthand book against his chest. 400 years of do not trust the voice, and seeing the edit is not the same as making it, and the offer was very good, and he set the ring to the spiral, and the characters that had once slid off his eyes lay still now under his gaze, legible, obedient, a language he had become a clause within, and then at last a writer of, and the spiral began to turn. It did not grind. It never had, but it turned the other way now, the way that meant out, and the cold, clean air he had not breathed in 4 centuries moved past him, carrying the faint, impossible scent of the world above, of a London afternoon, of weather and distance, and the green, wet, ordinary aliveness of a place where things were still being written. "You will come back," the hollow said behind him from the deep dark, and it was not a threat now, it was something stranger, almost a question. "They all think they will not, and they do not because they die. But you will live, and the living change their minds. You will stand in your quiet, avenged world, and you will grow tired again, and the offer will still be good, and I will still be here." The dark drew in one last time, intimate, close, the way the worst news is always delivered. "I am the only thing in existence that will never leave you. Remember THAT when the others do." Harry stood in the opening door with 400 years folded behind his eyes, and he did the thing the hollow had not predicted in 600 years of throwing quills into the dark, which was that he turned back and he looked into the deep shelves where the bound thing waited, and he answered it not as a prisoner to his cell or a victim to the architect of his suffering, but as one immortal to another, which is what he had become without quite noticing the moment it finished. "I know you'll be here," he said. "That's the difference between us. You think being permanent makes you patient." He stepped onto the threshold, into the cold, clean air, into the first light he had not made himself in 400 years. "It just makes you slow." He walked out of the oubliette of years. Behind him, soundless, the spiral turned closed on a library that had a sun in it now. A cold light he had left burning high above the shelves where the dark could not drink it. The first thing any warden had ever given the place that it could not take back. And beneath that light the hollow beneath sat in its repaired and deepened chains and began, in the only way such a thing could, to wait, and to want, after 5,000 years, something it could not simply outlast. Ahead of him the deep tunnel of Gringotts opened, and a cart sat on the old narrow track where a cart had sat 400 years and one day ago, and the air smelled of stone and distance, and faintly of the world and Harry Potter, who had gone into the dark a 15-year-old with a wand he no longer needed and come out of it, something the wizarding world had no word for and no defense against, stood in the deep dark of the bank that was a scab over a wound in the world, and felt the afternoon waiting for him a quarter-mile up, unfinished, and the people in it who thought a day had passed, and the one who had not signed the note, and the mouse who had been gnawing the dam. He had told a locked room there would be time after to feel all of it. He found, standing in the tunnel with the centuries behind his eyes, that he was not ready to open that door yet. There were accounts to settle first, and a world to recalibrate, and an afternoon that did not yet know it had been waiting 400 years for him to come up the track and finish it. He set his hand to the cart, which knew the warden's ring and woke to it, and he stepped aboard, and he started up, toward the light, toward the day that thought it had only lost an hour. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. One day later the cart climbed, and Harry made himself small, which after 400 years of being the largest thing in any room took a deliberate act of will. He understood the necessity as he understood everything now, by reading the room before he entered it. Above him the bank was full of people who believed the world had a fixed number of categories, and that a 15-year-old who had gone down to a vault that morning belonged in one of them. If he came up the track radiating what he actually was, he would break that belief, and a broken belief makes noise, and noise was the one luxury he could not afford until he knew where Crewe had gone. So he banked himself as he banked his light. He pulled the 4 centuries down behind his eyes and let his face become the face of a tired student who had spent a dull hour in a counting house, and the effort of it, the sheer descent into a smaller shape, was the thing that finally made him feel the centuries as a weight rather than a wealth. The platform where the public carts turned around was bright. He had stopped expecting brightness. Not the cold suns he made for himself, which were facts, but careless light, light thrown around by torches that did not know they were being generous, light that fell on goblin faces and ledger brass and the green livery of the bank without anybody having earned it. He stood in it and let his eyes adjust the slow human way, because forcing them would have been a working, and a working would have been heard, and a teller looked up from a counting table and saw him and went still. It was the old one. The walnut-knuckled goblin who had driven him down the narrow track to the round green door, 400 years and one afternoon ago, the one who had set a debt older than the bank and the keys must turn. He was a day older now, and not at all, and he looked at Harry the way you look at a sum that has come out wrong, a column you have added 1,000 times that has, this once, refused to total. "You drove me down," Harry said. Voice in the bright air came out level, unhurried, the voice of someone with nowhere he had to be, which after centuries of having nowhere he could go was a private joke only he could hear. "I never got your name." The goblin's hands did not move on the table, and the stillness of the hands was the loudest thing in the chamber. "Corin," he said at last, "keeper of the lower track. Corin, keeper of the lower track, so you've made this drive before, down with a wizard, up with a ring." He let that land. "Up alone, mostly. How many times have you driven a warden down and then, a decade later, gone back to fetch the ring off his finger because there was nothing else of him left to fetch?" Corin did not answer, which was an answer. "I hold nothing against you." It was true, and Harry was mildly interested to find it true, as he was interested in most of what was left in him after the dark. Blame was a thing you spent on people you believed could have chosen otherwise, and he had read the debt too clearly now to believe the goblins had ever had a choice. You inherited a machine. You didn't build it. You don't even know what it holds, not really, only that it must be fed, and that feeding it is the price of your charter and your gold and the long, uneasy peace your people keep with mine. I read the whole of it from underneath. I know more about what Gringotts is than the goblin who runs it. That isn't a boast, it's a warning, and the warning is this. He crouched, bringing his bank-down face level with Corin's, and he let one layer of the smallness slip, just one, so that for the length of a breath the old goblin saw what was actually behind the young eyes, and Corin, who had driven the lower track for 140 years, made a sound in the back of his throat that goblins do not make in front of wizards. The thing you keep down there is not feeding anymore, Harry said softly. I saw to that. The line is whole, Corin, whole as it has not been in 5,000 years, and it will hold without another quill thrown into the dark, which means you can stop. No more wardens, no more carts down with a wizard and up with a ring. Tell whoever you answer to that the debt is paid in full by the last one you collected, who collected himself instead. He stood, he let the smallness close back over him, and tell them one thing more. Gray clerk from the department who came to fetch me, the one who calls it attunement. I want to know where he files himself when he isn't down here pretending to be staff. Corin looked at him for a long moment, and then he did the thing no goblin had done for a wizard in the memory of the bank, which was to climb down from his stool and stand and incline his head, not in service, which goblins despise, but in the particular acknowledgement that one keeper of a terrible secret pays to another. The carts know him, Corin said. They have carried him to the lower track 40 times in my keeping. He does not come from the ministry's front halls, whatever his letters say. He comes from below them, from the rooms with no doors that anyone will admit to. The goblin's eyes were old and flat and certain. Your kind has a name for that place. The Department of Mysteries, Harry said. The carts call it the quiet floor. He will not be there now. He files his attunements in the morning and is gone by dusk every time because he does not care to be in the bank when the wardens settle. He says it is unprofessional to linger. Something that was almost the ghost of a goblin's humor crossed the ancient face. He has lingered for none of them in 140 years. You will be the first he should have stayed for. Thank you, Corin. And Harry meant it, which surprised him less than it would have surprised the child who walked down. He had learned in the dark that gratitude was not weakness, it was bookkeeping, and he kept very good books. Walk well. When they ask you what came up the track today, tell them the truth. It'll go easier for you than a lie, and I'd rather you kept your charter through this. Somebody honest should keep the door now that it doesn't need a body behind it. He left the old goblin standing in the bright chamber and walked up through the bowels of the bank, and at the turning where the deep stair passed the dragon's cavern he stopped, because he had made himself a promise 4 centuries ago, and he was a person who kept his books. The dragon was where it had always been, where it had been for longer than Corin had been alive, a half-blind Ukrainian iron-belly chained in the dark and trained by pain to flinch from the sound of a struck clapper, its hide gone pale and slack, its great chest heaving in the stale air of a life that had never once included the sky. The goblins called it security. Harry read it as he now read everything, and what he read was not a monster. It was a sentence written in cruelty, a long forced argument that had bent a creature of fire and weather into a furnishing, and the cruelty was so old and so total that the dragon no longer remembered there had ever been another way to be. He could have walked past. The dragon was not his account to settle, and he had a great many that were, and a man with 400 years of judgment knew better than to spend his first afternoon of freedom on every cruelty he passed. He walked past. And then he stopped and came back because there was one thing he had decided about himself in the dark, and it was the only thing he was not willing to bank, which was that power that walks past the chain because it is busy is not different in the end from the power that did the chaining. He did not free it. Loosing a maddened, half-blind dragon into the streets of London would have been a cruelty of a different shape, and he had read too far to mistake a grand gesture for a kindness. He did the smaller, harder thing. He reached into the long sentence of the dragon's training and edited out the flinch, the conditioned cringe at the clapper, the learned smallness, and he left the creature its strength and its wildness and gave it back the one thing the goblins had taken, which was the knowledge that it had not always been a prisoner. The dragon went still. Its blind head turned toward him in the dark, and for a moment something passed between the thing in the chains and the thing that had walked out of deeper chains, an understanding with no words in it, and Harry said quietly, "Not today. But someone is going to open this cavern one of these years, and on that day you'll remember you were never furniture." Then he climbed the rest of the way to the light, and behind him a dragon that had not lifted its head in a decade held it high and waited. He climbed the rest of the deep stair slowly, not from any weakness of the body, which he had kept obedient across 4 centuries, but because he wanted to learn the bank again on the way up, to read the surface of the place he had only ever read from underneath. The public levels, when he reached them, were a different country from the deep track. Here the stone was dressed, and the iron was bright, and the air smelled of lamp oil and parchment, and the ordinary greed of a working day just ended, and goblins moved along the galleries closing ledgers and dousing lamps with the brisk indifference of clerks anywhere who have survived another shift of other people's money. None of them looked at him. He had seen to that. But he looked at them, at the whole patient machinery of the bank, and he understood it now in a manner he never could have as a schoolboy waiting for a cart, that all of this, the gold in the galleries and the courteous contempt the goblins kept for wizards, was a roof, an enormous and beautiful roof raised across 6 centuries over a hole no one was allowed to remember, and that the goblins kept the roof in good repair without ever once being told what the rain would be if it fell. He passed a young goblin polishing the brass of a lift gate, a creature who could not have been more than 40, which for a goblin was barely grown, and the young goblin glanced up out of habit and then went still in the manner Corin had gone still, some inherited instinct recognizing a thing the conscious mind had no file for, and Harry paused because he had decided on the long climb that he would be courteous to the keepers of the roof. "You don't know me," he said, "and you won't remember this clearly, which is a mercy I'm doing you, not myself. But your people have kept something for a very long time, at a cost they were never told, and the cost is paid now in full. The deep work is done. Whatever your elders feel when the old ledgers go quiet tonight, you can tell them a wizard said the debt is closed and the keeping can be honest from here." The young goblin said nothing, because there was nothing in any apprentice's training for this, but its clever eyes followed him the rest of the way along the gallery, and Harry let them, because a thing witnessed by even one honest pair of eyes is a thing that has begun already to be known, and he had decided that being known was the whole of his plan. He came at last to the gallery above the great hall, and below him the marble spread out the color of old cream under the chandeliers, and the last customers of the day were filing toward the bronze doors, a woman counting coins into a purse, an old wizard arguing mildly with his own reflection about whether he had remembered his key. He stood at the rail and watched them for a moment, the unremarkable traffic of a world that did not know it had been, that very week, 3 nights from never having existed, and he felt no contempt for the smallness of their errands. He felt the opposite, the thing he had walked 400 years of dark to be able to feel again. That the smallness was the point, that a woman counting coins into a purse on an ordinary evening was precisely the kind of thing the first writers had died to keep written, the kind of thing the Hollow wanted blank, the kind of thing he had refused at the chain table to let end. He had not come up out of the dark to rule these people, or to be thanked by them, or even particularly to be known by them. He had come up to make certain the woman got to keep counting her coins, on this evening and on as many ordinary evenings as the world could be made to grant her, and the certainty of that, standing at the rail above the emptying hall, was the steadiest thing he owned. He crossed the marble hall, the long counters and the chandeliers and the queue of ordinary witches and wizards conducting the loud business of being alive, and not one of them looked at him twice, because he had made certain of it, and because the human eye slides off a thing it has no category for exactly the way his own eye had once slid off the spiral on the door. He stepped through the great bronze doors of Gringotts into the last of an ordinary afternoon, and the world nearly took him apart. He had prepared for this. He had told himself on the long climb what it would be, and he had been wrong, because there are things you cannot rehearse, and the sky is one of them. He had not seen the sky in 400 years. He had reconstructed it on the watch, recited its blue, kept the fact of it in a lit room of the mind, and the fact was a photograph, and this was the thing itself. The actual evening sky over Diagon Alley, a high cooling vault of it going gold at the rooftops and green-blue overhead and showing, in the east where the day was already losing, the faint first pricking of a star. It was so large. That was the part the reconstruction had never managed, the largeness, the way it simply kept going up with no shelf and no ceiling and no edge his reading could find. And Harry stood on the steps of the bank with the centuries folded behind his eyes and looked at one ordinary sunset and understood, with the part of him that was still and always 15, that he had been in a box, that the box had been real. That he had spent 400 years in a room you could have crossed in 20 strides while this went on without him, vast and free and indifferent, every single evening, 400 years of evenings, 140,000 sunsets he had not been allowed to see. He did not weep. He had set down the machinery for that a long time ago in a locked room with a promise attached. But he stood very still on the steps while Diagon Alley flowed past him, and he let himself feel, for the length of one held breath, the grief of the 140,000 sunsets, the only thing he let himself name even to himself that evening. And then he put it in the locked room with the rest and closed the door, because there were accounts to settle and the dead do not get sentimental about weather, and he was not going to be the dead, not yet, not for a very long time. The smell came. Bread somewhere in the green wet of the cobbles after a day's spilled cauldrons and wood smoke, and under it the specific mineral nothing of the clean cold vault air still clinging to his clothes, the smell of the space between 2 ticks of a clock, fading now as the world wrote itself back over him. He breathed it the slow way. He had 400 years of practice at making a single sensation last, and he spent some of it on the bread. He passed a darkened shop window, a robe maker's shut for the evening, and the glass gave him back the thing he kept forgetting, which was his own face. 15. Round-cheeked, untidy-haired, the scar a pale comma at the hairline, a face that had not aged an hour while the mind behind it spent lifetimes. He looked at the reflection the way you look at a portrait of an ancestor you happen to resemble, with recognition and no ownership. That had been him. It was still, in the law of the body, him. But the eyes in the glass had gone somewhere the face had not followed, and the dissonance of it, the centuries staring out of a child, was a thing he would have to manage every time he passed a window for the rest of his unnatural life. And he decided standing there that he would not edit the face younger to match the lie everyone needed, and he would not edit the eyes older to match the truth. He would simply carry the gap. He had become, he was learning, a person made mostly of carried gaps. Then, because he was who he had become, he stopped looking at himself and started reading the street, and the street told him what year he had walked back into. It was a place holding its breath. He read it in the shutters half down before dusk, in the way people walked in pairs and glanced at doorways, in the cluster outside the apothecary reading a notice with the particular stillness of people receiving bad news politely. A boy was selling the Evening Prophet from a stack by the steps, and the headline was doing two contradictory things at once, the way a headline does only when the people who print it are at war with their own front page. It shouted in large type that the ministry urged calm and that rumors of you-know-who's return were the work of attention-seekers and the disturbed, and beneath that, in the small type the large type was meant to bury, it listed a bridge that had fallen and a family that had vanished and an inquiry that would, the ministry assured everyone, find perfectly ordinary explanations. Harry read the whole front page in the time it took the selling boy to make change, and he understood the political weather as precisely as he had understood the sky. The world he had come back to was a world in denial. Voldemort had returned in a graveyard on the night before the morning crew came for him, and the ministry had decided that the cheaper truth was no truth at all, and the Order was fighting a war the government insisted was not happening, and into the middle of that careful official silence, someone had quietly filed away the one person whose survival was the proof everyone was trying not to see. It was good craft. He could see the shape of it now from the outside, as he had learned to see the shape of the lattice from underneath. Remove him in the season when no one is allowed to admit he matters, and there is no outcry, because an outcry would mean conceding the war, and the ministry would sooner lose Harry Potter than admit it needed him. Whoever had planned the ceiling had not merely found a hole to put a boy in. They had found the 1 month in a century when the world could be relied upon to look the other way. That was not the work of a clerk following procedure. That was the work of someone who understood the politics of the surface as well as Harry now understood the binding underneath, and the two of them, the planner and the prisoner, had been reading the same machine from opposite ends without ever meeting. He marked it beside the gray clerk and the loosened stitches and the mouse gnawing the dam, and he added it to the bill. That was when he found the watcher. She was good. He would grant her that as he granted the hollow its craft. She was reading the same prophet stack, 2 steps down and to his left, a thin woman in a charcoal coat with a clerk's soft hands and a clerk's forgettable face, and everything about her said end of a long day, just buying the paper, except for 3 things that Harry read in the first second and that no ordinary person would ever have assembled into a conclusion. She had not turned a single page. Her eyes had not moved across the headline she was pretending to read, and the air around her had the particular flat quality of someone holding a working ready under the skin, a curse drawn and not yet thrown, the way you keep a hand near a wand without keeping a hand near a wand. She was not Order. The Order watched you the way Tonks was watching from 3 shop fronts up, badly, warmly, like people. This one watched the way an actuary reads a table. He did the thing she did not expect, which was to walk down 2 steps and stand beside her and read the headline over her shoulder, close, companionable, the way strangers do at a notice board. They'll find perfectly ordinary explanations, he said, conversational, nodding at the small type. They always do. It's remarkable what the ordinary will stretch to cover if everyone agrees in advance not to look underneath. To her credit, she did not flinch, and to his greater interest she did not pretend not to understand. The soft clerk's face turned to him, and the eyes in it were not soft at all, and she said in a voice with the same sanded flat quality as Crewe's, the house style of the quiet floor, "You're meant to be downstairs, Mr. Potter." "I was downstairs," Harry agreed. "It got crowded." He let her see in his face that he knew exactly what she was, and he watched her recalculate, watched the working under her skin gather toward a decision, and he spoke before the decision could finish forming, mild and unhurried, the voice of someone discussing the weather. "Before you do the thing you've been sent to do if the attunement failed, which I'm guessing is to confirm the failure and then make sure there's nothing left to confirm twice, I'd like you to do some arithmetic, because people in your line of work heed arithmetic and very little else." He did not raise his wand. He had not, in fact, drawn it. He wanted that on the record between them that he had done all of this with his hands empty. "You drew a curse the moment you saw me. It's still drawn. It has been drawn for 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds I have read the precise sentence that holds it in your nerves, and I have read the 3 faster sentences that would unmake it, and you and the cobbles you're standing on, and I have decided to use none of them, and the deciding is the only reason this conversation is still happening. I want you to understand that the empty hands are a courtesy. They are not a limitation. Lower the curse. She lowered the curse. He read her do it, read the working dissolve back under her skin, and he understood that he had just done, on the steps of a bank at dusk, the thing the Hollow had warned him he would spend the rest of his life doing. He had stood in a room and seen every way it could end, and he had chosen the sentence over the edit, and the choosing had felt like nothing at all, which was the part that should trouble a person and no longer troubled him. Good, Harry said. Now. You're going to go back to the quiet floor, and you're going to tell the gray clerk that the attunement did not fail. Tell him it walked out. Tell him the line is whole and the wardens are done and the debt is closed. And tell him that the last quill he filed has some questions about a man who picks at 5,000-year-old bindings to free a thing he does not understand, and that the questions will be asked in person on his floor at a time of my choosing. He stepped back, giving her room to leave, because a cornered actuary is the only kind that gambles. You can run now, I won't follow, I already know where you're going. She went, disciplined about it, no scramble, a brisk professional retreat into the thinning crowd, and Harry let her go because he had told her the truth. He did not need to follow a thread back to a spool when he could already read the whole of the cloth. He had wanted Crew to know he was coming. Being hunted, he had learned across 400 years on the wrong end of it, was a kind of light. It showed you the shape of the hunter by where the shadows fell. He intended to give Aurelian Crew something to flinch from, and then to read, very carefully, where the flinching pointed. Harry Potter, he had heard her coming, of course. He had marked Tonks from the moment the doors opened, read the whole street as a moving text, and catalogued the threats and the children and the broom-arguers in the time it took an ordinary person to blink, and he had let the watcher's business conclude before he turned, because he had not wanted the two of them in the same scene. Now he turned and gave Tonks the young face, and it cost him. Tonks, he said, watcher. She came up easy in the offhand way of someone whose errand had been a formality, hands in the pockets of a patched purple coat, hair an improbable shade of bubblegum. Blimey, you were down there a while. Moody had me posted since 2, said the whole audit business smelled off and somebody ought to keep an eye, and I've been pretending to shop for an owl I can't afford for 3 hours. She tilted her head and the easiness flickered, the aura under the friendliness noticing something the friendly part had not caught up to. You all right? You look, I dunno, tired round the eyes. Did the goblins give you trouble about the vault? 400 years, Harry thought, and the first person to see me come back asks if the goblins gave me trouble about the vault. There was no contempt in the thought. There was almost the opposite, and he found that he wanted to be careful with the smallness of the question, the way you are careful with a letter you wrote as a child and find again grown. She could not know, none of them could know. He had walked out of a country that did not appear on their maps and back into Tuesday, and the kindest thing he could do for now was to let her keep the Tuesday. It took longer than they said it would, he answered, which was true at a depth she would never measure. The vault was complicated. Yeah, well, vaults. She said it to fill the air, and then she was already turning, already hurting, the aura's instinct to get the asset moving. Come on, I'll side along you back to HQ, everyone's been. She stopped. She looked at him properly this time, and whatever the patched coat and the bubblegum hair were for, underneath them was a trained set of eyes, and the eyes had finally caught what the rest of her had been ignoring since she said his name. Harry, you haven't moved. No, Harry agreed. People move, she said slowly, when you tell them you're about to apparate them somewhere. They flinch, or they argue, or they grab your arm. You're just standing there looking at me like you're reading the bottom of a page. Her wand was not in her hand, but it had migrated closer to her hand, the way a careful person's wand does when the world stops adding up. Where's the kid who'd be asking me 100 questions about why Moody thought the audit was off? And there it was, Harry thought, the thing that marked out a good aura, which was that the danger reached her as information before it reached her as anything else. She had noticed the discrepancy. She did not yet know what it meant. She was sensibly getting ready for it to mean something dangerous, and she was right, and he found that he did not want to lie to her, because she had loitered 3 hours over an owl she couldn't afford on the off chance that a boy needed her, and that bought her something. Not the whole truth would break the Tuesday, but not a lie. He's still in here, Harry said. The kid who'd asked 100 questions. I keep him in a room and let him out when it's safe. It hasn't been safe in a long time. He watched her parse that, watched the patch coat friendliness fall away entirely, leaving the aura which was the version of her he could actually work with. You're right that something's wrong, Tonks. Moody's right. The audit was a cover. The gray clerk from the department didn't take me to my vault. He took me somewhere there are no doors anyone will admit to, and he left me there, and he's done it 40 times before me, and he'll do it again unless someone who knows where the bodies are buried gets to him first. He let her hear in the level of it that he was the someone. I need 2 things from you, in this order. First, lower the hand drifting toward your wand, because if this turns into a fight on the steps of Gringotts at dusk, it ends in a way neither of us wants and only one of us survives, and I'd rather not start the evening that way. Second, take me to Dumbledore. Her hand stopped drifting. She was very still now, reading him as he had read her and getting a great deal less because he had spent 4 centuries learning to be unreadable and she had spent perhaps a decade learning to read, and that was not a fair contest and both of them knew it. "You're not Harry," she said. "I'm exactly Harry. That's the trouble you're having. Everything you can check says I'm Harry, the face, the scar, the voice, and everything you can feel says you're standing next to something wearing Harry like a coat, and you can't make the halves agree, so your training is shouting Polyjuice or Imperious or Glamour and you're wrong on all three, and in about 4 seconds you're going to decide to stun me and sort it out at HQ." He had been watching the decision form behind her eyes as he watched everything form now, every way the moment could end laid out like clauses. "Don't, not because you can't, because I'm going to tell you something only Harry knows, and then you're going to have a much worse and much more accurate problem." She didn't stun him. He had read that she wouldn't, not quite yet, because Aurors who are any good are also curious, and curiosity had bought him 400 years of survival, and he was willing to gamble it bought him 4 more seconds. "In my 3rd year," Harry said, "a Dementor got onto the Hogwarts Express and I passed out, and afterward I couldn't look anyone in the eye for months, and I never told a soul why, because everyone kept telling me it wasn't my fault and I couldn't stand being told. You weren't there, but Lupin was, and Lupin pays attention to people, and you'd have heard it the way you hear everything over tea second-hand, a quiet little story about the kid who faints near Dementors." He watched it land. "I'm telling you so you understand the size of what's happened to me, because the kid who couldn't meet a friend's eyes after a train ride is the same person standing in front of you, and he can look at anything now, anything at all, and you learn to look at anything by living through the things that make a train very small. I've lived through a great many trains, Tonks. I did it alone. I did it somewhere a day takes 100 years to spend. And I came back to settle accounts, and I'd very much like the first one I settle this evening to not be with one of the few people in this city who was ever kind to me." The street went on around them, gold dying to gray at the rooftops, the apothecary's shutter finally down, and Nymphadora Tonks stood on the steps of Gringotts and looked at a 15-year-old with 4 centuries behind his eyes, and her face did the thing he had been waiting for, the thing that told him she was worth the truth, which was that it stopped trying to make him fit a category and simply bravely let him be the thing he was. 100 years today," she said, quietly, not a question. She was a clever woman and she had just done the arithmetic he had spent a week refusing to do, 4 centuries deep, with his back to the bones. He watched the figure reach her, watched the largeness of it land the way the sky had landed on him, and she did not look away from it, and that was worth something. "More or less. How long, Harry?" "Long enough that I'm going to ask you to keep calling me Harry," he said, "because it's the truest name I've got, and I'd like to keep being able to answer to it." He looked east where the star had been joined by a second, and he let himself have the sky for one more breath because he had earned it, and because it would be there tomorrow and the night after and every night, and that, more than any spell he had learned, was the thing he had come up the track to be certain of. Now, Dumbledore, Grimmauld Place, he's... Tonks caught herself on the secrecy reflex and then visibly decided that the rules of secrecy had been written for a smaller world than the one she had just been shown. "There's a meeting tonight, he'll be there." She studied him, and the Auror and the kind woman in the patched coat reached, together, the same conclusion. "You're not going there to be looked after, you're going there to look at him." "I'm going there to find out which of two things he is," Harry said, "because there are only two, and I've had 400 years to lay them side by side. Either Albus Dumbledore knew what the oubliette of years was and signed me into it for what he'd call the greater good, in which case he and I are going to have a conversation he has spent his whole life avoiding, because no one has ever been able to make him have it." He started down the steps and she fell in beside him without deciding to, which told him she had already chosen, whatever she still thought she was deciding. Or he didn't know. Someone used his name and his seal and his reputation as the lure, the way you'd bait a hook with a worm, and he has spent the day believing a boy was doing a dull audit while that boy spent a lifetime in the dark. And if that's true, then the most dangerous wizard in Britain has an enemy clever enough to move him across the board without his ever feeling the hand, and he doesn't know it, and I'm about to be the one who tells him. "Which do you think it is?" Tonks asked. Harry walked into the gathering dark of Diagon Alley, the centuries folded behind his eyes and the warden's ring cold on his hand, past the lit windows of a world that thought it had lost an hour, and he gave her the honest answer because he had decided in a library at the bottom of the world that the people who earned the truth would have it. "I think the answer doesn't change what I do," he said. "It only changes whether I'm sorry while I do it." He glanced at her and he let the young face show her the one thing that was the same all the way down, 4 centuries unchanged. "I used to think that mattered more than it does, being sorry. I've had a long time to take it apart. It turns out the people you put in vaults don't get any warmer because you regret the door. They get out or they don't. I got out." The first lamp of the evening flickered a light above them, throwing his shadow long and ordinary across the cobbles, a 15-year-old's shadow, the wrong size for the thing that cast it. Take me to the meeting, Tonks. Let's go and find out who I have to be sorry to. She took his arm. Ali folded sideways in the wrench of side-along apparition, a sensation he had not felt in 400 years and found almost unbearably familiar. The clumsy bodily magic of the world above, magic that pushed, magic the oubliette would have drunk in an instant, and that here simply worked, generous and wasteful and free. They came down in the dark of a London square that had not changed in a day or in 400 years. The tall grimed houses, the broken lamp, the smell of the city and the river. Number 11 stood where it always had. Between 11 and 13, where there should have been nothing, the air held itself the way warded air does, waiting to be told it was allowed to remember number 12. Harry stood on the pavement and looked at the gap where the house of his godfather hid, the house he had left that morning, 400 years ago, with a cloak over his shoulders and an unsigned note in his pocket, and a child's whole stupid trust that the people inside had read the room. He had loved this street once in the uncomplicated way you love a place because the people you belong to are inside it, and he found, standing on the pavement with the centuries behind his eyes, that the love was still there, banked and quiet, a coal he had carried up out of the dark on purpose. Through the warded gap he could feel them as he felt everything now, a dozen lives clustered in a basement kitchen, arguing, planning, drinking tea, keeping a war out of a city that did not know it was at war. And among them, brighter than the rest, older, more carefully folded, a sentence he had fought as a rewritten ghost for a year in the dark and beaten, the long, layered, formidable text of Albus Dumbledore, sitting in a kitchen certain of his own depth, about to learn exactly how shallow a deep man can be made to feel. He's down there, Tonks murmured. Harry, whatever you are now, he's the most powerful wizard alive. He was, Harry said, and he stepped toward the gap in the world where the house was hidden, and the wards that had been written to keep out everyone who did not belong felt him coming and read what he was, and did the only thing such writing can do in the presence of a hand that can revise it, which was to open quietly unasked the way a lock opens for the one who wrote it. Come on, he'll want to be sitting down for this, and he'll pretend he doesn't. The door of number 12 swung inward on a hallway full of lamplight and the murmur of a war council, and Harry Potter walked back into the house he had left that morning a lifetime ago, and the troll-leg umbrella stand was exactly where it had always stood, and somewhere in the kitchen a voice laughed at something, and the sound of ordinary human laughter in a warm room reached him across 400 years of silence, and very nearly did what the hollow never could. He let it. For one step in the dark of the hall he let the laughter in, and he did not put it in a locked room, because some things you carry up out of the dark precisely so you can feel them again, and a warm kitchen full of people who thought he had been gone a day was, he decided, worth feeling, even at the price of how much it was going to cost to walk in there and change everything they thought they knew. Then he opened the kitchen door. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The manipulator's table, the kitchen of number 12, was warm and loud and full of people who would have died for him, and Harry stood in the doorway and let it hurt, because he had decided on the stairs that he would not arrive numb. There were a dozen of them around the long scrubbed table, the war council mid-argument, parchment and teacups, and a map of the country waited at its corners with mismatched salt cellars. Molly Weasley had her back to the door, ladling something. Moody's magical eye spun toward Harry before the rest of the room registered the draft. Remus Lupin looked up from a list, mild and gray and tired. Kingsley's deep voice was saying something measured about ministry denials. Severus Snape stood apart by the dresser, arms folded, a black punctuation mark in the corner of the room. And at the head of the table, half-moon spectacles catching the lamplight, hands folded around a cup he was not drinking from, sat Albus Dumbledore, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of being the cleverest person in any room he had ever entered, and he did not yet know that the arithmetic of the room had just changed under him. Sirius saw Harry first. He was at the far end, tipped back in his chair, and he came forward onto four legs with a scrape and a grin that cut Harry somewhere he had bricked over so long ago he had stopped checking whether the bricks held. There he is. We were about to send a search party. How was the thrilling world of vault audits? Did they make you sign things in triplicate? Alive. He was alive, ordinary, mildly bored, complaining about the length of a meeting, a man who had spent the afternoon thinking about the price of dragonhide gloves and not about anything that mattered. Harry had imagined Sirius dead 1,000 ways in the dark. He had built the loss and locked it in a room and visited it on the watch like a grave. And here was the grave, tipped back in a chair, asking about triplicate. It was educational, Harry said. Something in the two words stopped the room. It was not loud. He had been careful that it not be loud. But the register of his voice was wrong for the body it came out of, too level, too unhurried, the voice of someone who had know where he had to be in all the time there had ever been, and a kitchen full of trained fighters felt the wrongness the way you feel a mist stare in the dark. Molly turned, ladle still in her hand, Moody's eye fixed and held. Lupin set down his list very slowly. Snape's folded arms came undone. And Dumbledore, at the head of the table, went still in the particular way of a man who has just heard a single false note in music he has been conducting for 100 years, and his pale eyes came up over the half-moon spectacles and settled on Harry with the weight of the most practiced gaze in Britain. Moody got there first because suspicion is faster than wisdom. His chair scraped back and his wand was up, and his real eye and his spinning one were both fixed on Harry, and the growl came out of him low and flat. Don't anybody move, that's not how the wards let a person in. Potter's keyed to knock, not to open. Whatever walked through that door opened my front door without asking, and there's exactly one wizard alive who can do that to this house, and he's sitting at the head of the table. The wand did not waver. So you'll tell me right now what was in the bottom of your trunk the night you came to Grimmauld, and you'll tell me before I decide to stop asking. A photograph album, Harry said, unhurried, not raising his hands, not raising anything. Leather, gold corners, the first pages are my parents' wedding. Hagrid gave it to me first year. Under it, a sneakoscope that doesn't work, a broken pocket, two-way mirror I didn't understand the use of yet, and your spare hip flask, Mad-Eye, which you left in the kitchen and I never gave back because I forgot I had it. It's still in the trunk. You can check. He let that settle. I could pass your test, Alistair. I could pass any test you've got because I am Harry, every inch of me that you can measure. The trouble is that the part of me you can't measure is the part that opened your door, and there's no question in your repertoire that reaches it. Constant vigilance was the right instinct. It's just aimed at the wrong threat. I'm not a thing that got inside Harry. I'm what's left of Harry after a great deal happened to him very slowly. The magical eye spun, reading him, finding nothing it had words for, and Moody, who had survived 60 years by trusting that eye, lowered his wand by a careful inch, which from Mad-Eye Moody was a standing ovation. Harry felt the legilimency arrive then under cover of the standoff. It came the way Dumbledore did everything, gently, almost apologetically, a feather touch at the edges of the mind, the probe of a man so accomplished that his intrusions felt like concern. 400 years ago it would have slid into him and read him like a pamphlet. Now it reached the outer wall of the city he had built in the dark and found a surface with no handholds, no seams, no door, a thing that did not resist because resistance is a kind of grip and there was nothing to grip. And Harry watched the old wizard's brow contract by a single degree, the only tell the most controlled face in the world allowed itself, as the most accomplished legilimens alive pressed against a 15-year-old's thoughts and felt his touch stop, the way a hand stops at glass. Snape felt it too, the way a duelist feels a blade move in another room. His black eyes narrowed. He had spent his life as the second-best legilimens in Britain, and he knew instantly the shape of his master failing at something, and he did the thing his nature demanded, which was to try it himself, a harder probe, a colder one, no apology in it at all. It met the same glass. Harry turned his attention to him without turning his head. Don't, Professor Snape, Harry said. You're better at this than almost anyone alive, and you've just learned that almost anyone alive is a smaller category than you thought. I won't embarrass you in front of the room by saying what I read off the surface of you while you were knocking on my door. I'll only say that you keep more locked away than anyone at this table, and that you and I are going to get along eventually, because you are the one other person here who understands that the locks are the point. Snape's jaw worked once and went still, and the not answering was the closest thing to deference Harry had ever seen Snape offer a living soul. Professor, Harry said then to Dumbledore into the quiet, and he let the corner of his mouth move not unkindly. I'd ask you to stop as well, not because it offends me, because it won't tell you anything and you'll spend the next 10 minutes circling why, and we don't have 10 minutes to spend on your circling. He stepped into the room. Sit, everyone. Please, this is going to be a strange evening, and it'll go better if no one's standing. Nobody sat. Sirius had come the rest of the way out of his chair, the grin gone, reading the wrongness now and not understanding it, which was worse than understanding. Harry, he said, and there was a question under the name, the oldest question, the one that asks, are you still you? It's me, Harry told him, and he made it gentle, because Sirius had earned gentle, because Sirius was alive and did not know he had been mourned. It's me, Sirius, that's the part that's going to be hard. Everything you can see is me. I just went a long way since this morning. He looked around the table at the faces he had reconstructed on the watch for centuries, Lupin's tiredness, Molly's quick fierce attention, Moody's professional suspicion, and he felt, banked and quiet, the coal he had carried up out of the dark, and he let it warm him for exactly as long as he could afford. I'm going to tell the headmaster where I was, and I'm going to do it in the next room, because some of what I have to say is a weapon, and I don't hand weapons to the people I came back for without asking. The rest of you are going to sit and drink Molly's tea, and trust that the one who walked in here is on your side, because he is, more than he has ever been, and that's the truest thing anyone will say in this house tonight. He turned to Sirius and he put his hand briefly on his godfather's arm, and the contact was the hardest thing he had done since the threshold opened, harder than the Watcher, harder than the sky. 5 minutes, then I'll come back and you can shout at me for the way I walked in. I promise, I keep my promises now. It's nearly the only thing I kept. Sirius looked at the hand on his arm and at the eyes above the 15-year-old face, and whatever he saw there made him sit down slowly, and that, Harry thought, was the measure of him, that he could be shaken to the floor and still choose to trust. He took Dumbledore to the drawing room. It was cold and dust-sheeted and hung with the moth-eaten black family tapestry, and Harry shut the door and woke a fire in the grate without a wand and without a word, drawing it up as he drew his cold sons, except that here in a world that did not drink, he let it be generous, let it crackle and throw real heat, because he had missed fire and saw no reason to deny himself. Dumbledore watched the wandless flame take and said nothing, and the nothing was eloquent. "Sit," Harry said again, and this time alone the old wizard sat in a dust-sheeted chair, folding his long hands, and Harry remained standing, which inverted 4 years of every conversation they had ever had. "You signed a note this morning," Harry said. "Or a note went out under your name and your seal, telling the people in that kitchen to trust the department's man and send me to Gringotts alone. The note wasn't signed, as it happens. The seal was real. The hand was a good forgery. I'd like you to tell me before I tell you anything whether you wrote it. And I'd like you to understand that I will know if you lie, not because I'm reading your mind. I've told you I can't be bothered, but because I have spent longer than you have been alive learning to read the thing a face does a quarter-second before the mouth catches up, and yours is about to do it, so choose carefully." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The fire threw moving light across the half-moon spectacles. "I did not write it," he said. "I knew of the audit. I approved it, in the loose way one approves 100 minor administrative matters in a week of running a war one's government denies. An unspeakable came to me with a Gringotts requisition and a security justification, and it was plausible, and I was tired, and I signed an authorization that was not this note." His eyes did not leave Harry's. "I have spent a great deal of my life, Harry, making peace with the things I have done deliberately for what I believed were good ends. I am not accustomed to discovering I have done a terrible thing by accident, through fatigue, by trusting a plausible voice. It is a new flavor of failure, and I find I do not care for it." "No," Harry agreed, "you wouldn't, the deliberate kind you can defend. You've built a whole philosophy for defending it, the greater good, the long game, the chessboard where the pieces don't get told the plan. The accidental kind just makes you a tired old wizard who got played. I imagine that's the part biting worst." He let that sit, and then he set it aside because he had not come to score points, he had come to recalibrate a board. "Here is what happened to me, headmaster, and I'm going to say it once plainly, and then we're going to deal with the part that still matters, which is not me." He told him, not all of it. He gave him the shape, the round green door, the oubliette of years, the ratio of a day to a century, the library, the discipline, the centuries. He watched Dumbledore receive each piece, and he watched the great mind do the thing great minds do, which was to keep working even while it absorbed a blow, fitting the new facts into the old structure, testing them. And he watched the moment the structure failed to hold them, and Dumbledore understood that the person in front of him had lived 400 years alone in the dark and come back sane, which is a thing no philosophy of the greater good had ever had to account for. 4 centuries, Dumbledore said very quietly. The warmth had gone somewhere else. What was left was older and steadier, and Harry liked it better. It was the wizard underneath the performance of the wizard. "And you are not broken." "I broke," Harry said, "early, completely. Then I decided that staying broken was a use of time I couldn't afford, and I rebuilt myself with better materials, and I kept rebuilding for 400 years, and the thing standing in front of you is the result, and you should understand that it is not the child you are managing. You were managing a resource, headmaster, a weapon you were keeping sharp and ignorant in equal measure, because an ignorant weapon doesn't ask where it's being pointed. I hold nothing against you for it." And he did not, which he had verified in the dark more than once. Blame is for things that could have gone otherwise, and you are exactly the kind who builds the oubliettes of the world, the kind who decides for everyone's good who gets put in the dark. You'd have used me until I broke and called it tragedy. The only difference between you and Crew is that Crew doesn't lie to himself about the cost, and you've made an art of the lie. It was a cruel thing to say and true, and he watched it land on the old wizard the way only a true cruel thing can, and he watched Dumbledore decline to defend himself, which was the most surprising and the most respectable thing he did all night. "You are correct," Dumbledore said simply. "I have spent my life deciding who must be sacrificed for the whole, and I have been wrong often enough that I no longer trust my own certainty, and yet I have never stopped, because the alternative to deciding is to let worse deciders decide." He turned the cup in his long fingers. "I learned the philosophy young, you know, with a friend. We were going to remake the world for its own good, the two of us, brilliant and certain, and my sister died in the certainty, in the crossfire of a duel between people who each knew best. I have spent the century since being careful, and the care has cost other people instead of me, which is the dirty secret of being careful. You have read all the way to the bottom of me and found the same hungry thing I have spent 100 years calling prudence. I will not pretend you are wrong. I will only ask you to notice that knowing the philosophy is a trap has never once stopped me using it, and that this is the actual horror of being me, far more than any duel." "I noticed," Harry said. "That's why I'm telling you the part that still matters instead of leaving you behind. A man who can't stop using the trap, but who at least sees it, is more use to me than one who never saw it at all." You're going to be tempted before this is over to decide that some life is the acceptable price of stopping the thing I'm about to describe. When that happens, I want you to remember this conversation, and I want you to bring the decision to me first because I have a great deal more practice than you do at being offered acceptable prices, and I have learned to read the invoice all the way down. Agreed, agreed, said Dumbledore, and the word cost him, and he paid it. Harry told him about the hollow. He told it carefully because this was the weapon, the thing he had not given the kitchen. He told him what was under Gringotts, what the lattice truly was, what the wardens had truly been for. He told him about the appetite of the margin for the page, and the binding the first writers had died to write, and the way it had been failing for an age because ink fades, and the way it had begun, lately, failing faster, because a hand that could not read it had learned to pick at it from outside. Watch Dumbledore, who had spent a long life accumulating the deepest knowledge in Britain, discover how shallow the deepest knowledge in Britain was, how the whole edifice of wizarding power sat on a scab over a wound no living wizard but Harry had ever read. The Department of Mysteries studies death, Dumbledore said slowly, and time and thought and love. There is a room of prophecy and a room of brains and a veil that whispers. I have always taken their secrecy for the ordinary jealousy of scholars. His eyes sharpened. You are telling me there is a faction within it that knows what sleeps beneath the bank and wishes it woken. I'm telling you there's a faction that's wanted it for centuries, under different names, and that they've never once had a member who could read the binding, so they've only ever been able to scratch at it and wait, Harry said. And I'm telling you that the clerk you trusted with a plausible requisition, the gray one who took me down, is one of them, and that he didn't put me in the oubliette only to remove an inconvenient witness in the 1 month the world would look the other way. He put me there to feed the failing line a fresh quill while his people scratched it from the other side, so the patching and the unpicking would race and the unpicking would win, and a great many years from now, after he was safely dead and beyond blame, the dam would break. He's not in a hurry, headmaster. That's what makes him dangerous. He thinks in centuries the way I do, except that I learned it in a hole and he chose it, and anyone who chooses to think in centuries has decided that nothing alive right now is worth protecting, which is the most dangerous decision a person can make in the calmest. Dumbledore was silent for a time. The fire had burned down to steady red, and the moth-eaten tapestry stirred in the draught, and the most powerful wizard alive sat in a dust-sheeted chair and looked at the thing the student he had been managing had become, and Harry let him look because the recalibration had to be complete or it was nothing. And what do they imagine they gain, Dumbledore asked, by unmaking the world? Peace, Harry said. They believe the same thing the hollow believes, which it told me itself at the bottom when it stopped lying, that everything written tends toward the blank anyway, that all our striving is only the long noise a page makes before it goes quiet, and that the one mercy left is to stop pretending and let the quiet come now all at once clean. It's the oldest seduction there is, sir. It wore the face of revenge when it offered itself to me. It wears the face of mercy when it recruits men like Crewe. It's the same offer underneath, end the story. They've dressed it in gray robes and given it a quiet floor and a requisition process, but it's the same thing I refused in the dark, and they will not refuse it because they've already decided the world isn't worth the trouble of keeping written. You refused it, Dumbledore said, and it was not flattery. It was a man checking a load-bearing fact. Alone, for 4 centuries, with nothing to hold to. I had one thing to hold to. Harry looked into the fire he had made. I made a promise to a locked room 100 years in that there would be time after to feel all of it. Everything I set down to survive, I set down on loan, not as a gift. The faction and the Hollow and Crewe, they've all made the opposite bargain. They've decided there is no after worth saving the feeling for. That's the whole war, headmaster, when you read it to the bottom. It isn't light against dark. It's the people who think there'll be an after against the people who have decided to stop waiting for one. Everything else is tactics. And the prophecy, Dumbledore said, mine, the one I built a life upon, the one that says you are the only one who can end Tom, does it survive your bottom, Harry, or is it one more thing you have read straight through? Harry was quiet a moment because the question was honest and deserved an honest answer. It survives, he said, but not the way you've carried it. You've read it as a leash on me, a destiny, a thing I owe the world. I read it as a description, the way I read everything now. It doesn't say I must, it says I can and that no one else can, and those are very different sentences, headmaster, and you've spent 16 years pointing me at the first one when the second one was the true one all along. I'll deal with Tom, not because a prophecy bound me to it before I could talk. Because I've read what he is now, and I've read what's coming behind him, and I'm the only one in the world who can stand in the gap, and a person who can stand in a gap and walks away has made the Hollow's bargain by a slower road. I refuse it standing up. That's the only obedience you'll get from me, and it isn't to you, and it isn't a prophecy. It's the after I promised a locked room I'd live to feel. The old wizard looked at the young face, and at the wandless fire, and at the eyes with 4 centuries behind them, and Albus Dumbledore, who had not deferred to another living soul since Gellert Grindelwald, inclined his head. Then tell me my tactics, he said. I have run out of reasons to be certain, and I find I would rather take orders from someone who has read the bottom than give them from a man who only thought he had. Where do we begin, and do not soften it? I have waited a long while for someone able to give me an order and mean it. It is less pleasant than I imagined and more of a steadier footing than I will admit twice. We begin with Crew, Harry said. He's the loose stitch I can reach, and I sent him a message at dusk through one of his own watchers because a careful man who thinks in centuries has exactly one reaction to being told the quill walked out of the inkwell. He runs his timetable forward. Whatever the faction meant to do slowly, they'll now do as fast as they safely can because the one variable they never planned for, a warden who reads the binding, is loose in the world. I didn't send that message to startle him into a mistake. I sent it to make him move so I could read where he moves to. He went to the door. He's moving already. He started the moment the watcher reached the quiet floor, but first I'm keeping a promise. Come on. He went back to the kitchen. It cost him and he paid it because a man who breaks small promises has no business making large ones. He pushed open the door and a dozen heads turned, and he stood in the lamplight and gave them what he could, which was not the whole truth but was not a lie. I'm all right, he said, into Molly's fierce silence and Sirius's white knuckles on the table edge. Something was done to me and I survived it, and I came out of it more than I went in. I can't tell you all of it tonight. I can tell you that the headmaster and I are going to go and stop the people who did it, and that I will come back, and that when this is over I am going to sit at this table and eat whatever Molly puts in front of me until I can't move, because I have wanted for a very long time to be in a warm room with people who'd notice if I left it. He looked at Sirius. Save me a seat. Always, Sirius said, rough, and it was enough, and Harry took the coal of it down into the dark with him. They went down through a sleeping London together, the old wizard and the thing wearing a boy, and Harry found the partnership easier to wear than he had expected, because Dumbledore, stripped of the need to manage, was good company, sharp and dry and unsentimental about his own legend. You knew, Harry said, as they walked the empty pavements toward the river and the alley that hid the bank, or you guessed that there was something under Gringotts. You've spent your life collecting secrets. A secret that large leaves a shape in the others, the way a heavy stone leaves a dent under a carpet. You felt the dent. I felt the dent, Dumbledore agreed. I told myself it was the goblin's affair. I told myself a great many things over a long life, Harry, and the common thread of all of them is that they allowed me to keep not looking at a thing I suspected I could not move. You will find, when you are older than even you are now, that the hardest discipline is not learning to see. It is refusing the comfort of deciding a thing is not your problem. He glanced sidelong at the young face. You did not refuse that comfort. 400 years alone and you came up the track and made the worst thing in the world your problem before you had so much as eaten. I have known a great many brave people. I am not certain I have known a stubborn one to match you. Stubborn's the word, Harry said. Brave needs an audience. Stubborn just needs a wall to push on. They reached the dark front of Gringotts, where the daytime crowds were gone and the great bronze doors stood shut under a moon the color of old bone. There's a dragon in the deep of this bank that they keep blind and cowed, and a nation of goblins keeping a secret they don't understand, and a thing at the bottom that wants the whole page back. When this is over, Headmaster, the wizarding world is going to have to look at the dent it spent 1,000 years not looking at. You're going to help me make it look. That's your tactics in the end. You've spent a life hiding terrible truths to keep people safe. You're going to spend what's left of it helping me tell one, because the only thing that ever actually kept the hollow chain was people knowing it was there. He laid his hand on the wood and read it open as he had read the wards of Grimmauld, and the bank that no thief in 1,000 years had breached let him in because he had stopped being a thief and started being something the Locks recognized as kin. They were not, as it happened, in time to stop the first thing Crew did. They were in time for the second, which was worse, and which told Harry exactly how far down Crew had gone. The quiet floor was not where they found him. They found him at the mouth of the deep track in Gringotts itself, after midnight, in the cold, clean air at the edge of the platform where a tongue of stone reached out over a drop with no bottom, and he was not alone. There were 11 of them in the gray, unmarked robes of people who had decided the world should end, arranged in a working Harry read from 40 feet away and did not care for at all. A ritual circle scratched into the ancient stone, candles that gave no light but somehow deepened the dark around them, the slow practiced chant of believers who had rehearsed the end of everything the way other people rehearse a hymn. The air over the circle had begun to do something Harry liked even less than the chant, a thinning, a place where the careful writing of the world had gone gauzy, and behind the gauze you could very nearly see the thing the first writers had died to keep out, the patient nothing, leaning its weight against a page that someone had deliberately worn thin. At the center of it stood Aurelian Crew, gray suit, gray hair, bone-pale wand, conducting the thing with the flat competence of a clerk filing the most important form of his life. Corin was there too, bound, gagged, set at the edge of the circle, the old goblin who had told Harry the truth, and Harry understood the second thing Crew had done, and the cold of it reached even him. The carts carried me the news, Crew said, without turning, his voice flat as ever, pitched to carry across the platform the way it had carried through the closing door 400 years and a day ago. The keeper of the lower track telling a wizard the bank's oldest secret. That is a breach of the goblin's own law, Mr. Potter, and the goblins, being literal, will not mourn him, and the department will not be asked. You have already cost me a great deal tonight. I am recovering the loss the only way the schedule allows, which is by accelerating. You taught me the binding can be read. I do not need to read it. I need only feed the failure faster than it can be patched, and you have given me cause to stop being patient, and an impatient man with 11 believers and a fresh life to spend can do in one night what I had budgeted 40 years for. He turned then, and his standing water eyes found Harry's, and there was nothing in them, no malice, no triumph, only the flat certainty of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at the end of the world as the answer. You should not have come back. You were the most stable anchor the line ever had. Now you are merely the most powerful loose object in the building, and loose objects in a working this size are fuel. Harry crossed the 40 feet of platform without appearing to hurry, and he did 3 things on the way, in the time it took Crew to finish the sentence, and none of them touched a single one of the 11 believers, because he had decided a long time ago in the dark what he would and would not do with the thing he had become. He read the binding holding Corin and unwrote it, and the old goblin's ropes were simply elsewhere, and Corin was free and breathing and dragging the gag from his own mouth with shaking hands, and the look the old goblin turned on Crew was a look 600 years in the making, the look of a keeper who has finally been shown what he was made to keep and has decided in one breath exactly whose side he is on. He read the ritual circle scratched into the ancient stone and changed one mark, the way you change one word to make a line scan, and the working that had been gathering to tear at the lattice closed harmlessly on itself. A sentence with its verb removed, 11 believers pouring their whole rehearsed will into a circle that no longer led anywhere, their chant collapsing into confusion as the thinning over the stone healed shut, and the patient nothing was shouldered back out of the world. And he read Aurelian Crew, the whole flat gray sentence of him, the childhood in the department and the slow logic by which a careful person talks himself into the mercy of ending everything, and he saw in the margin every edit that would stop him, and he chose, as he had chosen on the bank steps and at the chain table, the sentence over the edit. He did not unmake the one who had buried him for 400 years. He stopped in front of him close the way the worst news is delivered close, and he let Crew see what reading without flinching looked like from the inside. You budgeted 40 years, Harry said quietly, and you spent your whole life being patient, and the one thing you never let yourself do in all that careful planning was go down and read the thing you were trying to free. You don't even know what it is. You think it's an ending. You think it's peace. He leaned in and his voice dropped to the register he had learned from the dark itself. I've talked to it for 400 years. It doesn't want peace, Crew. It wants the page. There's a difference, and you'd have learned it about a second after you succeeded, and then you'd have had no second to learn anything in ever again, because the mercy you've worked toward your whole gray life ends with you too, and everyone you ever loved, and the very idea that there was ever anything worth loving. You're not a priest of mercy. You're a mouse who found a dam and mistook knowing for wisdom. He straightened. I'm not going to kill you. I want you alive and sane and able to understand exactly what you did, because that's a worse sentence than the one you wrote for me, and I've become a connoisseur of sentences. You're going to tell the department everything. You're going to tell them what's under their bank. And you're going to spend the rest of your ordinary, mortal, mercifully brief life knowing that the world you tried to end is going to go right on being written, by people who decided it was worth the trouble, and that you'll die in a world you failed to make quiet, which is the only revenge I find I actually want. Crew looked at him, and something moved behind the standing water eyes at last, and it was the thing Harry had come for, the shadow thrown by fear, and Harry read where it fell. Where it fell told him everything. Crew's faction was not the top of the thing. There was someone above the gray clerk, someone the believers ranked higher than the end of the world itself, someone who had promised them the quiet and who had lately found a faster instrument than a slow conspiracy of unspeakables. The shadow fell toward a name, and Harry read the name in the angle of the flinch, and it was a name the whole kitchen at Grimmauld would have known, the name Dumbledore had organized his life around, the name the ministry would not print. He found you, Harry said softly, reading it off him. The faster instrument. He doesn't believe in your mercy, he doesn't believe in anything, but he heard there was a thing under Gringotts that could unmake death itself, and a creature who has cut his soul into pieces to outrun dying will walk toward anything that promises to finish the job for everyone but him. You opened your quiet little door to the one being on the surface hungry enough to come through it. You've spent your whole gray life trying to end the world gently, and you handed the key to the one person who'd use it as a throne. Behind him, in the cold of the platform, Albus Dumbledore said one word, and it was the name, and it was not a question. Voldemort. He's coming for the bank, Harry said, and he turned from the broken circle and the scattered believers and the freed goblin and the gray ruined clerk, and he looked at his new partner across the deep dark of the place that was a scab over a wound in the world. Not tonight. He's careful too, in his way, and I've just made the prize harder to take by being standing next to it. But he's coming because Crew's people told him what sleeps down here, and a thing that can unwrite death is the one treasure left that Tom Riddle doesn't already believe he owns. He started up toward the light, toward the long climb out, toward the war that had just stopped being the war anyone thought they were fighting. Which means before he reaches the hollow, he and I are going to have a conversation. He has spent his whole life walking into rooms and watching them go quiet around him. The corner of Harry's mouth moved, cold and certain in the dark of the deep track. He has no idea what's about to walk into his. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, The Terror of the Age. Beneath him 3 days passed before Voldemort sent for him, and Harry spent them learning how to be a person again, which was harder than learning to read the world, the reading he had down. It was the rest he had lost the trick of, how to sit at a table and pass the salt, how to let a conversation wander without solving it, how to be in a room with people who moved at the speed of one lifetime and not flinch at how fast they spoke and how little they meant by it. He had come up out of a place where every word cost a century of consideration, and the surface world chattered, and the chatter was a kind of weather he had to learn to stand in without reading every drop. He practiced at Grimmauld in the warm, loud kitchen, in the seat Sirius had saved him. He ate Molly's cooking and let the taste of it be larger than it was. He let Sirius rib him about being mysterious. He answered Lupin's careful questions with careful half-truths. And he watched the order rearrange itself around him by slow degrees, the way a room rearranges itself around a fire it has decided is safe to sit near. And he understood that the recalibration was spreading outward from that kitchen, person by person, the quiet redistribution of who waited on whom, and that within a week the most powerful people in Britain would all, without quite saying it, be waiting to learn what he wanted. There was a particular discipline to it that he had not expected to need and could not have learned in any book. In the vault, his attention had been a single beam he could hold on one page for a decade. Up here, attention was supposed to scatter, to flit, to ride the surface of a dozen half-finished thoughts at once, and a man who could not let it scatter read every twitch of every face at the table as though it were the only sentence in the world, and the reading exhausted the people he aimed it at. So he taught himself to dim. He taught himself to let Tonks be funny without cataloging the ache under the funny, to let Molly fuss without reading the war she fussed against, to be, for hours at a time, only a guest at a table. It was the hardest magic he performed all week, and the only one no one noticed, which was the point. Ron was the one who made it bearable in the end, and Harry had not expected that, because in the dark he had used Ron mostly to laugh and Hermione mostly to think, and he had braced for the laughter to be the thing that did not survive contact with the real. It survived. Ron found him on the second night sitting alone in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m, not sleeping, because a man who has owned every hour for 400 years does not easily hand 8 of them back to oblivion every night, and Ron did not ask what was wrong. Ron sat down across from him and got the chessboard and set it up and said, "You used to be rubbish at this. Let's find out if whatever happened made you any better, because if you can suddenly play chess I'm going to have some questions." And they played in the dark, and Harry let himself lose the first game on purpose and won the second one honestly, and Ron studied the final position for a long moment and said, quietly, not looking up, "You went somewhere bad, I'm not going to ask. But you're back and you're still the bloke who threw a game so I wouldn't feel weird, so as far as I'm concerned you're you, and anyone who says different can talk to me." It was the most either of them ever said about it, and it was enough, and Harry slept after, the first true sleep since the threshold, 4 hours of it, a gift from a friend who refused to make it complicated. Dumbledore moved fastest of all, because Dumbledore was honest with himself once forced to be. The old wizard had spent 2 of the 3 days at the department, using Crew's confession and 60 years of accumulated leverage to pry open the quiet floor, and on the 3rd evening he brought what he had found to the drawing room, and he laid it out for Harry the way a junior partner lays a brief before a senior, which was a thing neither of them remarked upon because remarking on it would have made it harder. "They are very old," Dumbledore said, spreading parchments across the dust-sheeted table, copies of records in 11 hands across 6 centuries. "Older than the department that houses them, which is itself a thing the department does not know about itself. They have called themselves the Quiet and the Conquered of the Last Page and the Stillness and a dozen other names that all mean the same thing, which is patience in the service of an ending. They do not recruit the cruel. That is what unsettles me most, Harry. I expected to find sadists and found instead the gentle, bereavement counselors, healers who lost too many, scholars who stared too long into the room with the veil and decided the whisper behind it was kinder than the noise in front." He set down a final page, a roster, and at its head, in a flat, careful hand Harry knew, was the name Aurelian Crewe. He recorded the deaths of children for the ministry for 11 years before he transferred to the only office that promised to make the dying stop. I do not excuse him. I am only telling you that the thing you are fighting does not look like a monster from the front. It looks like the most reasonable person you have ever met on the worst day of your life offering to make the hurting end. I know what it looks like from the front, Harry said. It looked like that for 400 years. It is the oldest argument there is, sir, and the reason it is dangerous is that it is half true. Suffering is real, and it is enormous, and nobody who tells you otherwise has been paying attention. The trick of it, the lie folded inside the true thing, is the leap from suffering is real to therefore the page should be blank. I made that leap once at the edge of the drop in the 1st century. I climbed back from it on the only handhold there is, which is that the same world that holds all the suffering also holds the people you would be ending it for, and you do not get to make that choice on their behalf because you got tired. Crew got tired, the whole quiet got tired. That is all this is underneath the robes in the centuries, the largest tantrum of exhaustion in the history of the world. He looked at the roster. What did you find in the room with the veil? Dumbledore was quiet a moment. A relic, he said, older than the building like the rest of it. The veil is not a doorway to death, whatever the unspeakables tell themselves. It is a place where the page has been deliberately kept thin, the way Crew's people kept the platform thin, a window the quiet have used for generations to listen to the thing beneath. They go to it to be comforted. They sit before the whisper and it tells them in their own voices that the striving is pointless and the quiet is coming and there is nothing to do but help it along, and they come away calmer and more certain and a little more dead inside, and they call it peace. His pale eyes were grave. I sat before it for the length of one breath to understand the enemy, and I will tell you, Harry, that I am 115 years old and I have buried almost everyone I have loved, and one breath of that whisper was very nearly enough. I left before it could finish a sentence. I do not think Crew ever left. No, Harry said. He moved a desk in. He looked at the roster, at the gentle ruined names, and he understood the shape of the war more completely than before, and he liked it less. How fast is the line failing now? The goblins took it for ordinary wear, accelerating across the last decade. Corin let me read the sealed ledgers. It is not ordinary. The quiet have a working they have refined for a generation, and when you broke their circle 3 nights ago you set them back years, not centuries. His eyes did not leave Harry's. But you also did a thing I do not think you intended. You made the prize public to exactly the wrong audience. Whatever the quiet were doing slowly and in secret, there is now somewhere, a person of enormous power and no patience at all who has heard there is a thing under Gringotts that can unmake death. And that person has never once in his life done anything slowly or in secret when fire would serve. No, Harry agreed, and he looked at the dark window where the ordinary stars hung, and he did the arithmetic of how long a creature like Tom Riddle would wait once he believed the cure for death was a single vault away, and the answer the arithmetic returned was not long, and he was right. It was Hermione who would not be managed, and Harry had known she wouldn't, and had been putting off the moment anyway. She cornered him on the 3rd evening on the stairs in the narrow space below the row of mounted elf heads, and she had clearly been planning the ambush for days, because she came at him with a folded parchment covered in her own cramped notes as she came at every problem, armed with research and refusing to be cowed by the answer. I've been keeping a log, she said without preamble, which was the most Hermione thing she could possibly have done and went through him like a blade. Of you, since the bank. The things you say the way you say them, the vocabulary is wrong, Harry. You use words you never used. You said unsentimental on Tuesday. You said epistemic. You corrected Bill's gobbledegook, and you do not speak gobbledegook. And you keep looking at the window like you are surprised it is still there. She held up the parchment, her hand very steady, her chin up. So I am going to ask you once, and I am going to know if you lie, because I have known you since I was 11, and I am better at reading you than anyone alive. What happened to you in that vault? And Harry looked at her, the real Hermione, 15 years old, frizz-haired, ink on her fingers, fierce and brave and entirely unaware that he had spent the better part of a century talking to a version of her he had built out of his own solitude. A Hermione assembled from the part of him that had paid attention to her for 4 years, who had reasoned with him in the dark and forgiven him too easily and finally agreed, in a conversation that had nearly broken him, to stop existing so that he could stay sane. He had held a funeral for her. He had buried the her that lived in his head so that he would not lose the ability to tell the conjured from the real. And here was the real one on the stairs with a parchment demanding the truth, and the distance between the Hermione he had mourned and the Hermione in front of him was 400 years wide, and he had no idea how to stand on the near side of it and talk across. Sit down, he said, and his voice did a thing it had not done since the threshold closed. It came out unsteady. Please, this is the conversation I have been dreading more than the one I am about to have with Voldemort, and I would like to have it sitting down, he told her. More than he had told anyone, because she was owed more, because the version of her in his head had earned the real one the truth. He told her about the years. He told her about the watch and the recitations and the names he had kept alive by saying them aloud to no one. And he told her because honesty was the last discipline, about the constructed friends, about the Hermione he had built and argued with and finally let go. And he watched the real one receive the news that she had been, in a sense, his only company through a span of time longer than recorded history, and that he had set her down to survive, and her steady hand finally shook. You made a me, she said quietly, in your head to not be alone. You were the best of them, Harry said. Ron kept me laughing, you kept me thinking. You are the reason I am sane, Hermione, the real reason, more than any discipline in any book. When I had to choose what kind of person to rebuild myself as, I built someone you would still talk to. That was the standard. Across 400 years, the test I kept applying to myself was whether the real you, if she ever met what I was becoming, would still sit on a stair and demand the truth from it, or whether she would back away. His voice was level again, but only because he was making it so. You just demanded the truth, so I passed. That is what you need to understand about the thing in front of you. It is not a monster wearing Harry. It is Harry who used the idea of his friends as the blueprint for staying a person, and who came back specifically so there would still be a world with you in it. She did not back away. That was the thing he would carry afterward, down into the dark that was coming. She sat on the narrow stair below the elf heads, and she took the hand of the 400-year-old thing wearing her best friend's body, and she held it, ink-stained fingers and all, and she said in a voice that wobbled and did not break, "Then I am not going to treat you like glass, and I am not going to treat you like a stranger. You are my friend who went away and came back wrong-aged. That is a Tuesday for us. We have had worse Tuesdays." She scrubbed at her face with her free hand, brisk, furious at her own eyes. "Now tell me what is actually under the bank, because the headmaster is being cagey, and I have read every book in this house, and not one of them mentions a thing that eats wardens, and I refuse to help you fight something I have not researched." And Harry laughed, the old laugh, the real one, the one that had died in the 1st century and that the real Hermione in 1 minute on a staircase had somehow handed back. And he understood that this was the thing the Hollow had never been able to offer and never would, not company conjured out of solitude, but a person who had known you since you were 11, refusing on a staircase to let you be alone with the worst of it. He held onto her hand. He let himself, for the length of the laugh, be a boy on a stair with his friend. He needed that. He had not known how much until she gave it, and he understood, holding it, that this was what he had walked 400 years of dark to recover. Not power, not vengeance, this, a staircase, a friend, a wobble and a brave voice, and that everything he had become was only worth becoming if it kept rooms like this one written. He showed the Order what he was the next morning, because they needed to see it, and because a tool you do not understand is a tool you misuse. He did it gently. Moody, still half convinced, threw a battery of testing hexes at him over breakfast without warning, the way Mad-Eye tested everything, and Harry let the first 3 pass through the place he had been standing because he was no longer standing there, and read the 4th out of the air before it finished leaving the wand and set Moody's teacup, which the 4th hex would have shattered, gently down 3 inches to the left, intact, full, not a drop spilled. The kitchen went silent. Moody's magical eye spun and found no wand motion to blame, no incantation to credit, only a teacup that had declined to be broken, and the old Auror lowered his wand and said into the silence, "Constant vigilance is going to need a new definition," and went back to his porridge, and that from Moody settled it for the whole Order at once. They had seen, they believed. And the believing rearranged the last of the room, so that when the sky finally burned that night, no one argued about who was in charge. He used the waiting to prepare, because a person who has owned every hour for 4 centuries does not waste the few that are handed back. Each night when the house had gone quiet, he sat in the dark drawing room with the cold fire he made for himself and turned his reading north and down, toward the bank, toward the wound the quiet had been worrying at, and he took the measure of how fast it was going. The answer changed every night, and the changing was the worst of it. A line worn by age fails at the speed of age, which is to say slowly, predictably, a thing you can plan around. This line was failing at the speed of intention now, and intention is not predictable, and somewhere up in the lattice a hand he could not yet name was learning, week by week, to do more damage with less effort, the way any craftsman improves at his trade. He read the curve of it, and he did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic kept getting shorter, and he told no one the exact figure, because a number like that, spoken aloud in a kitchen full of people he had come back to protect, would only buy them sleepless nights and change nothing, and he had learned in the dark the difference between honesty and cruelty dressed as honesty. He wrote the brief on the 3rd night, the one he would leave on the drawing-room table for Dumbledore, and writing it was the closest he came, in those 3 days, to grief, though he did not let himself call it that. It was an instruction for how to fight the Hollow without him. He set down everything he could that did not require the reading, every fact about the lattice and the wound and the nature of the binding that a person who could not see the seams might still use, every contingency, every way the surface world might buy time it did not know how to buy. He wrote it plainly in an ordinary hand, no shorthand, because it was not for him, and when he finished it he understood that he had just written his own replacement, the manual by which the world would carry on if the one who could read it did not come back up the track, and a thing in him that he had set down in a locked room 100 years before pressed quietly at the door, and he let it press, and he did not open the door because there was work yet, and the door could wait. As it had waited 400 years, Dumbledore found him at it near dawn and read a page over his shoulder without asking, which Harry permitted because the old wizard had earned a great many small trespasses in 3 days of being honest. "You are preparing to lose," Dumbledore said, not as an accusation, as an observation, the flat, clinical note of a fellow strategist. "You do not expect to." "I expect to win and I prepare to lose," Harry said, not looking up from the page. "That isn't pessimism, headmaster, it's bookkeeping. The people who only prepare to win are the people who leave the world a smoking hole when they are wrong because they never wrote down what they knew. I am not going to be one more brilliant man who took the only copy of the answer into the dark with him. Whatever happens at the bank, the knowledge survives on this table, in a hand anyone can read. That is the actual victory, the one that does not depend on me. The rest is just which of us walks back up the stairs." The old wizard was quiet a moment, and then he set his hand briefly on the page, on the careful, ordinary handwriting of a creature who had every reason to hoard his knowledge and was instead giving it away in plain words to people who could never repay it. "I spent 100 years, Dumbledore said, believing that the safest place for a dangerous truth was a single trustworthy skull. Yours, eventually, was to be that skull. I see now that I had the whole architecture backward, and that you saw it backward and built it right side up in a single afternoon, and I find I am not too old, after all, to be taught." He straightened. "Finish your brief. I will see that it is read, whatever the morning brings." And Harry finished it, page after honest page, while the real sun came up gray and ordinary over a London that did not yet know how close it stood to never having had another morning at all. Then the dark mark burned over Gringotts, and the staircase and the chessboard and the careful breakfast were over. It was not subtle. Voldemort had decided subtlety was beneath the occasion, and the great green skull and serpent hung in the night sky above Diagon Alley, visible across half of London to anyone who could see past the muggle-repelling charms, and it was a summons, and it was addressed, though it bore no words, to exactly one person. He had heard then. The quiet, or what was left of them, had told their faster instrument that a child had walked out of the deepest vault in the world knowing how to read its secret, and Voldemort, who collected powerful things the way other people collect grievances, had decided to acquire that knowledge or remove it, and had announced the decision in fire over the bank he meant to crack. "You are not going alone," Sirius said, in the kitchen, with the whole order on its feet and reaching for cloaks. "I am going alone," Harry said, "because everyone who comes with me is a hostage I would have to spend the fight protecting, and the single advantage I hold over him is that I have nothing left he can threaten me with that he can reach. He's going to do the thing he always does, which is to find the person you love and put a wand to them, because that is the only sort of power he understands, the power to make you watch. I spent 400 years learning that the only way to win that game is to be a person it cannot be played on. Tonight I am going to show him what that looks like." He looked around the kitchen, at Hermione white and rigid by the dresser, at Ron beside her with his jaw set hard, at Dumbledore already cloaked and already knowing the argument was lost. "Stay here, keep each other alive. That is the mission, and it is not a small one, and I am trusting it to you because you are the people I trust. If I need you, you will know, because the sky will tell you. And if I am not back by dawn, the brief is on the drawing-room table, headmaster. You will know what to do, and you will be able to do it without me, because I wrote it for exactly that." Hermione crossed the kitchen and did not argue, which was how he knew she had understood everything. She put something into his hand, small and cool, and closed his fingers over it, and it was a galleon, one of the enchanted coins from her study group, and she said low, "It is keyed to mine. If you cannot shout, tap it, I will feel it. You do not get to be alone with the worst of it, not anymore. That is the deal you made on the stairs, whether you meant to or not." And Harry closed his hand around the coin and found he could not speak for a moment, and the not speaking was a kind of speaking she understood, and he put the coin in his pocket next to the warden's ring, the oldest key and the newest, and he went out under the burning sky alone, but carrying the coin, which was not the same as alone, and was the whole point. He found Voldemort waiting on the steps of Gringotts, in the exact place Harry himself had stood 3 days before reading a sunset, and the Dark Lord had brought 20 Death Eaters and arranged them in a crescent, and at his right hand stood Bellatrix Lestrange, vibrating with the particular devotion of someone who has made a religion out of one person's approval. Voldemort stood at the center of the crescent, tall and white and noseless, the most dangerous thing the wizarding world had produced in a century, and Harry walked up the empty alley toward him at an unhurried pace, hands in his pockets, one closed around a coin, and read him every step of the way. What he read he had half expected and still found remarkable. Voldemort was a sentence that had been mutilated on purpose. Where a person's text ran whole from a beginning toward an ending, this one had been hacked into pieces and the pieces hidden, the soul split and split again and lodged in objects scattered across the country. A cup, a locket, a diadem, a snake, a ring already ruined, a diary already destroyed, and one splinter lodged by accident in a scar Harry had carried since he was a year old. He read all of it in the time it took to cross the cobbles. He read the Horcruxes like footnotes to a creature who had so dreaded the full stop of his own sentence that he had defaced the whole text to avoid it, and he understood, reading it, that Voldemort and the Hollow and crew were the same animal wearing 3 sizes of robe, each at war with the plain fact that stories end, each willing to ruin everything written rather than accept a last page. Harry Potter, Voldemort said, and his high cold voice carried down the alley the way Crew's flat one had carried across the platform, the voice of someone accustomed to being the loudest silence in any room. They tell me you have been somewhere interesting. They tell me you walked out of a vault that has held wizards since before my ancestors could spell their names, and that you came out knowing its secret. I find I am curious, which is a thing I am not often. Come. Tell me what you learned in the dark, and I may let your blood traitors live to see the morning. You sent up a skull to ask me a question, Harry said, stopping at a conversational distance, closer than any of the 20 Death Eaters thought a sane person would stand. You could have sent an owl, but you do not do questions, do you? You do demonstrations. The skull is a demonstration. The 20 friends are a demonstration. You have spent so long being the thing that empties a room that you have forgotten how to want something without first making the room go cold. It is a tell, Tom. It is the tell of someone who has never once been the second most dangerous thing in a conversation, and has no idea what to do when he is. A ripple went through the crescent. Nobody called him Tom. Bellatrix hissed and her wand came up, and Voldemort lifted one long white finger, and she froze, trembling because his approval was the only weather she lived in, and Harry watched the exchange and read in it the whole architecture of the creature, the same architecture he had read in Dumbledore, a creature who could only feel real by the size of the silence he could impose on others. You will not use that name, Voldemort said softly. I will use whatever name reads true, Harry said, and that one does because under the snake face and the split soul and the 70 years of effort, you are still an orphan who could not stand that thing's end, and everything you have built is one long tantrum at a full stop. I have met the thing you actually flinch from, Tom. I have talked to it for 400 years. It is under this bank, and it is so far past you that you are not even a rival to it. You are a recruitment poster. The quiet did not bring you in because you are powerful. They brought you in because you are hungry, and a hungry thing will tear a hole in the world trying to feed, and that is the only thing they need from you, an appetite big enough to crack a dam they have spent centuries failing to crack. You think you have come to take the power under this bank. You are the crowbar they intend to leave in the wound. Enough. Voldemort raised the U-wand, and the killing curse left it without ceremony, no flourish, the casual murder of a man swatting a fly, the green light crossing the cobbles toward Harry's chest faster than any human reflex could answer. Harry read it coming and did not move because moving was unnecessary. He had stood at the edge of every way a moment could end for 400 years, and he edited the green sentence out of the air a foot from his chest, unwrote it as he had unwritten Corrin's ropes, and the curse that had ended more lives than any other spell in Britain arrived at a place where the rules were different and ceased to be, the way a wave ceases to be a wave on the flat of the beach. The alley went silent. 20 Death Eaters and 1 Dark Lord watched the killing curse fail against a 15-year-old who had not lifted a hand, and the silence that followed had a texture Voldemort had not had to stand in since he was a child in an orphanage emptying rooms of the children who would not play with him. Bellatrix broke first. She always would. Her devotion could not bear to watch her master fail at anything. She flung herself forward with a curse on her lips that Harry recognized as the one she had used on the Longbottoms, and he turned his attention to her without turning his head, and he read the curse and the arm that threw it and the long, ruined sentence of the woman behind it, and he did not unmake her, because he did not unmake people he could stop. He simply edited the next 4 seconds so that her own momentum carried her past him and her wand was, abruptly, in his hand, and she stood disarmed and astonished a pace beyond where she had meant to be, and Harry said mildly, not even looking at her, "Sit down, Bellatrix." The adults are talking, and she sat hard on the cobbles, because her own legs had received an instruction they could not refuse, and the rest of the crescent did not move at all, because the rest of the crescent had just done some arithmetic. "That is the recalibration," Harry said quietly into the silence, and he let them all hear it. "You have organized your whole existence around being the thing the green light obeys. And it does not obey me, Tom, because I read it before it finishes being cast, and an unanswerable thing is only unanswerable to people who cannot read. You are not the most dangerous thing in this alley. You have not been since I walked into it. The only reason you are still standing is that I do not kill people I can fix, and you, against all the evidence of 70 years, are fixable, which is going to be the great surprise of your wretched, deathless life." He did 3 things then in the space of a breath, as he had done 3 things crossing the platform to Crewe, and each one landed on the Dark Lord like a tolling bell. He reached out across the country with the sight that read through stone, and he found the Horcruxes one by one, the cup in a deep vault, the locket in a stolen house, the diadem in a forgotten room of a school, the snake coiled at its master's feet, and he did not destroy them because destroying them was a war the Order had braced to fight for years, and he had no wish to spend lives on it. He read them. He read the torn edges where the soul had been hacked, and he wrote the edges shut, not killing the fragments but sealing them, so that they could anchor nothing and hide nothing and shelter nothing, so that the cup was a cup and the locket was a locket and the snake was only a snake. At the center of the crescent, the Dark Lord felt every anchor of his stolen immortality go quiet at once, felt himself become, after 70 years of frantic division, a single mortal sentence again, with a beginning and a middle and now the plain possibility of an end. He read the splinter in his own scar, the accidental anchor he had carried since he was a year old, and he unmade it cleanly without pain, evicting the last shard of Tom Riddle from the place it had squatted his whole life, and the old pressure behind his eyes that he had carried so long he had stopped noticing went silent, and the quiet of it was the most personal freedom of the night. And he read Voldemort whole, the entire defaced text of him, and he saw in the margin the single edit that would end the Dark Lord where he stood, the full stop he had spent 70 years fleeing, and he held the sight of it, and he chose, as he had chosen on the bank steps and at the chained table in Overcrew's flinching shadow, the sentence over the edit. "I could end you now," Harry said. "You feel it. You have felt it since the curse died. You are this moment a mortal man standing in front of someone who could close your sentence with a thought, and the thing crawling up your spine is the exact thing you have spent 70 years making other people feel, and you have no name for it because no one ever taught you the word because you were always the one teaching it. I am not going to teach it to you tonight. I am not going to kill you, Tom, and I want you to understand why, because the why is the worst thing I will do to you. I am not killing you because you are not the threat. You were never the threat. You are a symptom of the same sickness as Crew and the thing under this bank, the sickness of creatures who would burn the library sooner than accept that book's end, and killing a symptom while the disease runs loose is sloppy, and I have become a careful reader. So you get to live. You get to be mortal and small and beneath me, and to watch me deal with the actual danger, knowing that the scourge of the age was set aside alive, like a piece lifted off the board and stood in the corner to watch the real game. I read that sentence for you. Enjoy your immortality." He paused. "You do not have it anymore. I forgot to mention." What happened next Harry had read as a branch of the moment and had hoped against, because it was the worst of the branches, and he was not yet so far from a person that he had stopped hoping. Voldemort made mortal, made small, made beneath, did the thing a creature built entirely out of the refusal to be lessened will always do when it is lessened, which is to lunge past the one who lessened it toward the only thing larger than itself within reach. He had come to take the power under the bank. Harry had just shown him that the power under the bank was the one thing left in the world that could make him more than he now was, the single door that led anywhere, but down to the full stop he could suddenly feel waiting. And Voldemort was not a creature who would walk the slow road of being beneath someone for even one night. He turned, robes snapping, and he flung the whole of his diminished and still enormous will not at Harry, but at the great bronze doors of Gringotts, at the deep dark beneath them, at the thinning place where the quiet had worn the page thin, and he poured into it the desperation of a being that has just been told the one thing it ever wanted is real, and beneath it and reachable through a single last act of magnificent ruin. "Tom," Harry said, and the warning in it was almost gentle. "Don't. You do not know what you are knocking on." But Voldemort had spent his whole life being the thing that knocked, and the dam he hurled himself against had been worn thin by centuries of patient mice, and a mortal Dark Lord with the strength of 70 stolen years was a great deal more than a mouse. Down in the dark beneath the bank, beneath the platform where the wardens had settled, something that had waited 5,000 years felt the page tear from the wrong side, felt a desperate mortal hand do in one night of fury what the careful quiet had failed to do in centuries of patience. The binding Harry had rewritten whole held, and the believer's worn place beside it did not, and the patient nothing put one slow finger through the gap. The ground moved, not an earthquake. Something worse, a sense of the writing of the world going briefly uncertain of itself, the cobbles forgetting for an instant whether they were cobbles, the green dark mark overhead guttering as the sky lost confidence in its own color. The 20 Death Eaters broke and ran, every one, even Bellatrix, scrambling up off the cobbles and fleeing, because there are things even the servants of Voldemort will not stand beside, and Voldemort himself staggered back from the doors he had assaulted as the cold poured out of the gap he had torn, the specific cold of the space between two ticks of a clock, the smell of a struck bell. The red eyes, which had spent 70 years dealing out a thing and never once receiving it, finally held what they had inflicted 1,000 times, and there was no name on the Dark Lord's white face for what moved across it, because he had spent his whole life making sure no one ever taught him one. "You opened it," Harry said. He was already moving, already past the staggering Dark Lord, already at the doors, reading the wound, reading how bad it was, and it was bad, it was the worst branch, the one he had hoped against. You impatient, desperate, magnificent fool. You wanted to be the crowbar so badly you did not wait to learn you were right. He laid both hands on the doors and read the tear, and the tear read back, and far down in the dark a voice he had not heard in 3 days, a voice he had bound deeper than it had been bound in 5,000 years, spoke into the back of his skull with the warmth he had learned to mistrust most of all. "Welcome back, little warden," said the hollow beneath. "I told you that you would return. I did not expect you to bring me a door." Harry stood at the torn threshold with the centuries folded behind his eyes and the broken dark lord at his back and the cold of the end of everything pouring up out of the dark, and the coin warm in his pocket against the cold ring, and he understood that the conversation he had walked out on 3 days and 400 years ago had never been going to end anywhere but here, at the wound, with the whole written world for stake. He took out the coin and tapped it once, the smallest message, the agreed message, "I am not alone with the worst of it," and somewhere across London a girl on a staircase felt it anew and began to move, and gathered the people who would not let him go down into the dark by himself. Then he turned to the diminished thing behind him, the orphan who had emptied 100 rooms, and finally walked into the one room that would not empty for him. "Tom," he said, and there was no triumph left in his voice, only the flat certainty he had learned from the dark itself. "You wanted to meet the only thing in the world bigger than you. Congratulations. You are about to try to stay behind me. It eats creatures like you for the practice, and I find to my own surprise that I am not finished keeping things written." And he stepped down into the dark toward the thing he had chained and the wounded Dark Lord's tantrum had torn, while above him the sky forgot for one long moment how to hold its stars. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The Unmaker. The deep track was colder than it had ever been, and Harry went down it reading the wound the whole way, and the reading told him he had perhaps an hour before there was no world left to read in. He had thought he understood the breach from the doors above. He had been wrong, which was rare enough now to be worth noting. From the surface, the tear had looked like a single finger of nothing pushing through a worn place in the page. Down here, descending the old narrow stair past the platform where the wardens had settled, he could see it for what it was. A run in the fabric of the written world, a ladder of failures climbing outward from the gap Voldemort's fury had ripped, each broken stitch dragging at its neighbors, the whole vast binding beginning to unknit from one bad seam the way a jumper surrenders to a single pulled thread. The hollow had not torn its way out. It did not need to. It only needed the page to keep forgetting itself, and a tear teaches a page how to forget faster than any patient mouse. The descent itself had begun to come apart. Stairs he had climbed 3 days before were uncertain of their own number now. He counted 41 going down where there had been 38 coming up, and then 35, the architecture of the deep bank losing confidence in itself, the nearer he came to the place where confidence ended. The witchfire lamps in their brackets guttered, not from any draught but because fire is a sentence too, and the sentences nearest the wound were beginning to stammer. He walked through a stammering world toward the silence at the bottom of it, and he did not hurry, because hurry was a thing you did when speed could change an outcome, and the only thing that could change this outcome was him arriving whole, so he arrived whole and unhurried and cold. At the foot of the stair, the round green door stood open on the oubliette itself, and Harry let his eyes rest, one last time, on the country that had made him. The cold suns he had left burning 4 centuries deep still hung high above the black ranks of shelving, faithful, the only light any warden had ever given the place that it could not take back. Down the long aisles he could see the chained table where he had read the index and refused the offer, and the worn place in the floor where a flag had been scratched by 1,000 desperate hands, and the patch of fitted stone where a set of bones had once been his reading desk and were now, by his own first free edit, fine gray dust at rest. He had hated this place. He had been kept here as a quill, starved at the threshold of survival, set against a thing that ate despair for an age. And he had also, he understood now, standing at the door he had once pounded bloody, learned everything he was inside it, every discipline and every loss and every line of the only language that could save the world tonight, and you do not get to keep only the parts of a country that were kind. He inclined his head to it, the library at the bottom of the world, the way you nod to a hard teacher at the end. Then he turned from it toward the wound, because the country had given him all it had to give, and what it had given him he was about to spend. Behind him, Voldemort followed, because Voldemort had nowhere else to go, and because some shred of the strategist in him had understood that the figure walking toward the end of the world was the only thing standing between him and it. He came down the stammering stair white and silent, the yew wand still in his fist and useless now, a king who had set fire to his own throne room and was discovering too late that he would have to stand in the smoke with everyone else. "It is colder than I expected," Voldemort said, and his high voice had lost some of its music, because music requires an audience and the dark down here did not listen. "I have walked in many tombs. None of them were cold like this." "That's because the others were endings," Harry said, not turning. "An ending is warm if you read it right. It is a thing finishing, and finishing is part of being written, and the written is warm because it is real. This is not an ending, Tom. This is the place where the writing stops. There is a difference, and you are about to learn it whether either of us likes it, and I would take no pleasure in your learning it if I had any pleasure left to spare. They reached the platform, the tongue of stone over the bottomless drop, and at its edge, where the round green door had once turned, the air was wrong, gauzy, thinning, and through the thinning came the cold that smelled of a struck bell in the space between two ticks of a clock. Stay back from the edge, I mean it. The thing on the far side of that is the one creature in existence that can give you exactly what you spent your life chasing, and it is precisely as terrible as getting what you want always turns out to be. He raised his cold suns brighter, the last grand working of the godhood he was about to spend, a dozen of them blazing up into the dark the way they had risen the night he first lit the oubliette, and by their light he and the dying dark lord and the patient nothing all regarded one another across the cold. The hollow spoke then, not into the back of his skull this time, but out into the air of the platform, because at last, after 5,000 years, it had a gap to speak through, and it filled the dark with the borrowed idea of a voice. Little warden, the cold pulsed with it. You rewrote my chains whole, and I commended you for it, and then a mouse with a king's appetite gave me what your wholeness need, which is a seam. I do not need the binding to fail. I need only one seam and the patience to let the rest follow, and I have nothing if not patience. The thinning widened by a degree, and through it Harry could feel the appetite of the margin reaching, slow and enormous and utterly without hurry, for the edge of everything written. You cannot rewrite this as you rewrote the chains. A chain is a sentence. A tear is the absence of one. You cannot edit a blank. You can only fill it, and filling a wound this size takes more ink than any single writer has ever held. The first writers knew this. It is why they died. The cold turned, almost gentle, almost fond, the register Harry had learned across 4 centuries to mistrust above all the others. I will make you a last offer, it said, and it is not the one you refused in the dark, because I have learned you since then, and I no longer insult you with revenge. Here is what I can give, and only I can give it. I can return your years. The cold leaned close, intimate, the way the worst news and the worst temptations are always delivered close. 400 years were taken from you. I am the place where taken things go. Step through and help me, and I will unwrite your sentence back to the morning of the threshold, and you will be 15 and whole, and OWD nothing, and the centuries will never have happened, and you will never have counted a wall or buried a friend made of your own solitude or forgotten your mother's face. I can make it so it was never done to you. No other power in existence can say that, and I say it, and I do not lie at the end. And Harry stood at the lip of the wound, and he considered it, because a temptation you dismiss quickly is a temptation you never understood, and this one was the best the hollow had ever made him, because it did not ask him to become cruel or to surrender or to die. It asked him only to be made innocent, to have the 400 years lifted off him as if they were a coat. To wake on a morning that had not yet gone wrong, 15 and unburdened and free of the smooth places and the locked rooms and the cold that smelled of a struck bell. No, Harry said, and there was no struggle left in it, because he had already refused this exact thing once, 400 years deep, when he had read his own sentence at the chain table and declined to edit the weight out of himself. You keep finding new wrappers for the same gift, and the gift is always the same. It's always the end of the story dressed as a mercy. You want to give me back my years by making them never have happened, but the years are not a coat. They're me. Every century is load-bearing. Take them out, and the thing that walks away isn't a free 15-year-old. It's a forgery, a copy of a person who never went through the thing that made him real. I spent 400 years becoming exactly true. I am not going to let you make me innocent, because innocent for me would be a lie, and I have become a connoisseur of the difference. He set his hands to the torn edges of the wound. Keep your offer. I've grown attached to my scars. They're the only honest thing I brought up out of the dark. Voldemort behind him made a sound. It was not a word. Harry knew without turning that the Dark Lord had drifted too close to the edge despite the warning, drawn the way the desperate are always drawn toward the thing that promises to fix them, and that the Hollow had noticed him, and that the patient nothing which did not hurry for anything was making an exception, because a mortal soul that has spent 70 years refusing to end is the single most nourishing thing the blank can be offered, the richest ink in the world to a thing that wants to write nothing at all. You, said the Hollow, and it was not speaking to Harry now. Tom, you came for the end of dying. I am the end of dying. There is no death in the blank, because there is nothing in the blank to die. Step through, and you will never end, because you will never have begun. It is everything you ever asked for. And Voldemort, who had cut his soul into 7 pieces rather than face a full stop, stood at the edge of the only thing in existence that had ever offered him true deathlessness, and looked into it, and at last, after 70 years, felt the thing he had spent his life inflicting, because the blank was not the absence of death he had imagined when he imagined immortality. It was the absence of having mattered. It was deathlessness purchased by never having been alive, and the part of Tom Riddle that had clawed its way out of an orphanage on the strength of mattering more than anyone, the the part that was, underneath all the ruin, the truest thing about him, recoiled from it. He staggered back from the edge with his white face slack and his red eyes wide and the yew wand falling from a hand that had forgotten it. "It is not what you wanted," Harry said quietly, watching him understand. "It never was. You want it to matter forever. That is a different thing from never ending, and you spent your whole life confusing them, and you almost walked into the difference. Death was never the enemy, Tom. Death is the full stop that means the sentence happened. The blank is the thing that means it never did. You have been running the wrong direction your entire life, away from the only thing that would have made you real." "Then end it," Voldemort said, and his high voice had gone to something Harry had never heard in it, low and even and almost human, the voice of a creature that has just been shown, at the last possible moment, the true shape of its whole mistake. "If you can do what you say, if endings are yours to give, do not let it have me. I have been many things, I will not be a thing that never was." The hollow reached for him anyway, because it did not require his consent, only his nearness, and the cold gathered around the staggering Dark Lord and began, slowly, to unwrite him, to read him backward out of the world. Harry saw it begin, saw the edges of Tom Riddle going gauzy as the page itself had gone gauzy, the creature who had murdered Harry's parents and haunted his childhood and cast the curse that had defined his life beginning to be erased into the patient nothing, denied even the dignity of a death. And Harry did the thing that surprised everyone present, including himself, including the hollow, including the diminished and dissolving thing that had been the nightmare of the age. He saved him, not his life. Harry could read that the life was already forfeit, that Voldemort had drifted too close and taken too much of the cold into himself and would not survive the next minute by any branch of any reading. What Harry saved was the ending. He reached into the dissolving sentence of Tom Riddle and he did not let the blank have it. He wrote fast, sure, 400 years of craft poured into 4 seconds, a full stop. A real one, a death. He gave his oldest enemy the one thing the enemy had spent a lifetime refusing, and the hollow was now trying to steal, which was an actual ending, a clean last page, the dignity of having been a sentence that finished rather than a sentence erased. And Tom Riddle, in the final instant of a long and ruinous life, looked at the one who had every reason to let the nothing take him and was instead, impossibly, granting him a death. And something moved across the white face that no one had ever seen there, and it might have been the beginning of understanding, or it might have been only the ease of a long burden set down. And then it was over cleanly, warmly, the way an ending is warm when it is read right, and the Dark Lord was gone, and he had. At the very last mattered because someone had bothered to end him properly instead of letting him be unwritten. "That was a kindness he did not earn," Harry said to the cold, "and I gave it anyway, and I want you to understand why, because it is the whole of the lesson you have refused for 5,000 years. I did not give him an ending because he deserved one. I gave it to him because endings are mine to give, and your entire claim is that they are yours. They are not. They never were. A full stop is not the absence of a sentence. It is the last and most important word in it. You have spent eternity believing you are the thing all stories tend toward, and you are not. You are only the margin, and the margin does not get to decide where the sentence ends. The writer does." He turned back to the gap, to the patient, enormous nothing, and he rolled the cold ache of the centuries up behind his eyes, and he made his decision, the fourth choice, the one the hollow had sworn did not exist. "And tonight I am the writer." He knew the cost before he paid it because he read everything now, and he read this too, all the way to the bottom, as he had read the offer at the chain table. The hollow had not lied. A tear this size could not be edited. It could only be filled, and filling it would take more understanding than any single mind had ever held, and Harry had, by the accident and the discipline of 400 years, very nearly more understanding than any single mind had ever held, and it was, he calculated, almost exactly enough. Almost. The gap between almost and enough was the cost, and he read what the cost would be, and it was not his life, because he would not fill the wound with blood as the first writers had. He would fill it with understanding, and understanding does not kill the one who gives it. It only leaves him with less. He would spend it. That was the price. 400 years of accumulated sight, the ability to read the seams of the world and revise them, the godhood he had carried up out of the dark, the power that let him unmake a killing curse with a thought and read a stranger's whole life across a cobbled street. All of it, very nearly all of it, poured into the wound to teach the page how to remember itself again. He would come out the far side carrying the memories, the discipline, the centuries of weight, the things that could not be spent because they were not power but self, and he would come out without the reading, without the editing, without the cold, fluent godhood that had made him, for 1 week, the strongest creature in the world. He would be a person with 400 years of mind and the ordinary magic of an ordinary wizard, which is to say he would be the most solitary sort of strong there is, vast in everything that does not show and unremarkable in everything that does. He read that and he weighed it against the alternative, which was the end of everything written, every kitchen and every sunrise and every staircase with a friend on it, and it was not a difficult sum, and he had always been good at sums. "You are going to tell me I am a fool," he said to the hollow conversational as he set his hands to the torn edges of the wound and began, "the same thing you told the first writers. You are going to say I am spending the only thing that makes me your equal to buy a world that will simply forget me again, and that you will only wait for the next seam, and that I am trading godhood for a few decades of being ordinary in a kitchen. And you will be half right, which is the most you have ever managed. But here is the part you cannot read, because you have never once possessed it." He began to pour the centuries into the wound, the accumulated understanding of 400 years, and it went out of him as warmth goes out of a body into snow, and the gauzy thinning over the gap began, thread by patient thread, to remember what it had been. "I am not buying the world a few more decades of forgetting. I am finished with forgetting. Forgetting is how you win. So I am not going to hide you again as the first writers hid you, as Gringotts hid you, as Dumbledore would have hidden you. When this wound is sealed, the whole world is going to know you are here. Not a faction, not a secret order on a quiet floor. Everyone. Children will learn your name in school the way they learn the names of the deep places of the sea, a thing that is real and dangerous and known and kept. You feed on being forgotten hollow. I am going to make you the most remembered thing in the history of the world, and a remembered margin is only a footnote, and a footnote cannot unwrite a page. That is the fourth choice. I do not kill you, and I do not free you, and I do not die filling you. I make you famous, and famous is the one cage you have never been able to gnaw." The hollow understood at last what was being done to it, and it did the only thing left to a thing of pure patience faced with a mind that had outweighted it, which was to spend all of its patience at once. It threw the whole gathered weight of 5,000 years of appetite against the closing wound, and the cold roared up out of the gap, and the platform shook, and the bottomless drop beside it seemed to deepen, and the patient nothing stopped being patient and became, for one terrible span, hunger raw and vast and ancient, reaching not for the world now, but for the single mind sewing it shut with its own substance. It was the hardest thing Harry had ever done, harder than the first silence, harder than the index, harder than refusing the offer at the chain table, because he was not refusing now, he was giving, and giving until it hurt, and then giving past the hurt, pouring 400 years into a wound that drank it as the oubliette had once drunk his light, except that this time he wanted it drunk. This time the drinking was the entire point. He felt the godhood go. He felt the seams of the world dim and close to him one by one as he spent the sight that read them. The library faded from his reading first, and that was the cruelest part of the cost, the part he had not let himself dwell on until it was happening. The black ranks of shelving that he had read across 4 centuries like the lines of his own hand, the 10,000 teachers, the index, the bark scrolls, the whole impossible hoard that had been his only country, dimming page by page into mere objects in the dark, beautiful and opaque, and no longer his to open with a glance. He was losing the country as he saved the world, and there was a justice in that he could not argue with, that the one who had been made by reading would buy everyone's safety with the unreading of himself, and he kept pouring, and the library went quiet to him, shelf by shelf, the way a city goes dark window by window as everyone in it goes to sleep. He was almost gone, almost spent, the platform black and roaring in the last of his centuries draining into the closing seam, the cold suns guttering out above him one by one as the magic that made them poured away, when the coin in his pocket grew warm and then warmer, and then the deep track above him filled with light that was not his. They came down the stair, all of them. Hermione first, wand up and blazing, with Ron at her shoulder and Sirius a step behind and Dumbledore behind him and Tonks and Moody and Lupin and Kingsley, and the whole order pouring down into the dark toward the roaring cold, because a girl had felt a coin grow warm and known what it meant and refused, absolutely and without negotiation, to let her friend be alone with the worst of it. They could not read the wound. They could not fill it. That was his to do and only his. But the Hollow's last assault was not only against the binding, it was against him, against the mind that was doing the binding, and a mind under that weight needs one thing that has nothing to do with power, which is the knowledge that it is not alone, and that they brought down the dark stair in their arms, the oldest magic there is, the only one the blank has never been able to read. "We're here," Hermione said, reaching him, not touching him, because she could see he was doing something that could not be interrupted, only attended. "You're not alone with it. We've got the rest. We've got you. Finish it, Harry. We'll still be standing here when you're done. That's a promise, and you taught me you keep those." "Whatever it's pulling at," Ron said, pale and steady at her shoulder, gripping a wand he could not use against an enemy he could not see. "It can pull at us too. That's the deal." "You don't get all of it," and Sirius said nothing at all, because there are moments a godfather has no words for, but he came and stood at Harry's back, close, a hand fisted in the back of Harry's robes as though he could hold him to the world by main force, and perhaps in the only magic that mattered down here he could. Dumbledore came to his other side, and the old wizard did not offer power, because he had understood in 3 days of being a junior partner that power was not what this needed. He offered the thing he had spent 100 years failing to give anyone, which was his whole undivided faith, freely, with no chessboard behind it. "Whatever it costs," Dumbledore said, low and steady, "we will help you carry the after. You will not have bought it alone, and you will not have to live in it alone. On that you have my word, and I find, at the very end of being the cleverest man in the room, that my word is the only thing I have left worth giving, and that I am glad at last to have someone worth giving it to. And Harry, with the last of 400 years pouring out of him into the wound, with his friends at his back and his enemy granted a clean ending, and the patient nothing shrieking its 5,000-year hunger into a dark that was, thread by thread, remembering how to be a world, finished it. The last of the tear closed, the cold cut off all at once, the way a scream cuts off when the door finally shuts. The thinning healed hole, sealed not with blood and not with secrecy, but with the freely given understanding of one mind that had decided the page was worth the cost of keeping. And the hollow beneath, the unmaker, the appetite of the margin for the page, was bound again, deeper than ever it had been bound, and this time not hidden, this time known, this time written into a sentence that the whole world would be told and would maintain by the telling. It did not speak. There was nothing left for it to say to a quill that had spent itself entirely rather than be spent. It settled back into the dark to wait, as it would always wait, but the waiting was a different waiting now, the waiting of a footnote that knows it has been read and filed and will not be forgotten, which is the one form of waiting that goes precisely nowhere. Harry took his hands from the sealed place, and he turned, and he looked at his friends in the light they had carried down into the dark for him, and he found that he could not read them. That was how he knew it was done. He looked at Hermione and saw a girl, his friend, shaken and fierce and crying, and he did not see the seams of her, did not see the sentence that held her together or the edits that would unmake her, did not see every branch of how the moment could end. He saw only her face. He had not seen only a face in 400 years. He had forgotten that it was possible to look at a person and not read them, to be surprised by what they might do next, to stand in a room and not already know the shape of it, and the not knowing which should have unmoored the thing he had become, washed over the person he had spent himself back into like the first warm water of a life he had given up hoping for. "I can't read you," he said, and his voice broke on it, and he let it break, because the locked room had not, after all, stayed locked, because the after he had bought turned out to include him, smaller, ordinary, spent, alive. "Hermione, I can't read any of you. It's gone. I spent it. I'm just," and the word he reached for was one he had not been able to apply to himself since the spiral closed 400 years and a week ago, and he applied it now, and it was the truest thing he had said in 4 centuries. "I'm just a person. I'm just standing in a room with my friends, and I don't know what happens next, and I can't find out by reading it. I have to find out the way everyone else does, by living it. Do you have the smallest idea how long I have wanted not to know what happens next?" And Hermione, who did not entirely understand what he had given up but understood completely what it had cost, closed the last of the distance and put her arms around the 400-year-old who was at last simply her friend, and held on, and Ron's hand came down hard on his shoulder, and Sirius's arm came around all 3 of them at once, and the order closed in around the place where the wound had been, a warm loud knot of the living in the deep cold dark. And Harry stood in the middle of it and did the thing he had promised a locked room 100 years before, the thing he had set down on loan and never as a gift, the thing he had bought the whole world and after in order to be able, finally, to do. He let himself feel all of it. He felt the 140,000 sunsets. He felt the smooth place where his mother's face had been. He felt the first silence and the constructed friends and their funeral, the 20 blank pages where a decade should have been, the cold floor, the warmth of the silver chains, the bones that had been his reading desk and then his rest. He felt the 400 years of a single room and the one day the world had charged him for them. He felt the loss of the godhood already, the strange, light, empty place where the reading had lived, and he found that he did not grieve it, because it had only ever been the price of an exit, and he had used it to buy a door, and a door you have walked through is not a thing you mourn. And under all of it, rising, he felt the thing he had not let himself feel since he was 15 and the spiral closed, the thing the hollow had sworn no quantity of years could leave intact, the thing that was not power and not knowledge and not even survival, the simple, unreasonable warmth of being a person who was loved in a room by the people he had walked out of eternity to keep. It was, he decided, worth 400 years. It was worth all of them. He would have paid them twice and counted it cheap. For a while no one spoke, because there are silences that are fuller than any speech, and the knot of the living in the deep dark held one of them. Tonks made more wand light, soft and steady, filling the platform with the ordinary yellow glow of people who intended to keep standing in it. Moody's magical eye made one slow circuit of the sealed place and then fixed on Harry, and the old Auror said gruffly, "I have spent 60 years learning what cannot be guarded against, and I will be learning what I just watched for the 60 I do not have left," which from Mad-Eye was something close to reverence, and then he put his wand away, because there was nothing here that needed guarding anymore. It was Ron who broke it properly, as only he ever could, with the single most useful sentence anyone said all night. Right, he said, looking at the place where the end of the world had nearly been, and then at his friend who had spent 400 years to close it. Well, I don't understand most of that, and I'm fairly sure I don't want to, and you look like you got dragged backward through every century at once. Can we please go upstairs before something else decides to wake up? I've had about as much cosmic doom as I can manage on no breakfast. And it was so exactly, perfectly Ron that Harry laughed again, and the laugh went round the circle and loosened it, and the living remembered they were living and began, by degrees, to behave like it. Harry told them then in plain words what he had done, because he was finished with locked rooms and they had earned the truth more than anyone alive. He told them he had spent it. The reading, the editing, the cold fluent power that had let him stop a curse with a thought and open a warded door without asking. He told them it was gone, poured into the seal, and that he could not get it back and did not want to, and that he was, as of tonight, an ordinary wizard with a very long memory, which was a stranger thing to be than either godhood or boyhood, and which he would have to learn from the beginning. He watched them take it in, watched Hermione understand the size of the sacrifice and open her mouth to grieve it on his behalf, and he stopped her before she could. Don't, he said gently, don't mourn it. I know what it looks like from outside, the most powerful person in the world giving it all away in one night, but you have to understand what the power actually was for me. It was the exit. It was the thing I built in the dark to get out of the dark, and a key is not a treasure once the door is open. I am not less tonight, I am lighter. I spent the ladder because I had finished climbing, and a man does not weep for a ladder while he is standing in the room it carried him to. He looked around the circle, at the faces lit yellow in the deep dark, the people he had walked out of eternity to keep. I would rather stand in a kitchen with you, ordinary, surprised by my own life, than read the seams of the world alone forever. That is not a sacrifice. That is the best trade I have ever made, and I have made some long ones. Sirius gripped the back of his neck, the rough wordless grip of a godfather, and said only, your dad would have done the same, and then, because he could not bear the weight of it straight, though he'd have made a much bigger mess of the dramatic exit, you've no idea, your father could not resist a flourish. And the circle laughed again, wet and ragged and alive, and the laughing was the first true repair of the night, the ordinary magic that says we're still here, all of us, and we are going to go on being here. Which is the only victory that ever actually counts. Dumbledore stood a little apart, leaning on nothing, looking older than Harry had ever seen him, and somehow, underneath the age, lighter too, like a man who has finally set down a board he has been carrying alone for 60 years. There is a thing we must do, the old wizard said, and it is the part that will be hardest, because it is the part that does not feel like victory. The world must be told, all of it. The thing beneath the bank, the price of forgetting it, the names of the wardens who paid it. He met Harry's eyes. I have spent a century deciding that people could not bear the truths I carried for them. I was wrong, and the wrongness very nearly ended everything, and I am too old to make it again. So I will help you tell it, Harry, with what authority I have left, and I will spend that authority freely, because a secret kept by one clever man is exactly how this began, and a truth held by everyone is the only ward that does not fade. Tomorrow, Harry agreed. Tonight there's breakfast and a kitchen and people who waited up. He looked at the sealed place one last time, the quiet edge of the world, the famous footnote that would get nowhere now, and he found he had nothing left to say to it, which was its own kind of freedom. The thing that had been the largest fact of his existence for 400 years had become, in a single night, simply a thing he knew about and need not think of, the way you know there is a deep ocean and do not carry it with you to lunch. They went up the long stair together, out of the dark that no longer held anything that wanted to eat the world, and the stair was certain of its own number again, 38 steps, every one of them where it belonged, because the world below had remembered how to be a world. On the way up, Dumbledore fell in beside him, and Harry told him the rest of the plan, the part that came after the sealing, the long part, and the old wizard listened the way a student listens, and agreed, because he had spent 100 years keeping terrible truths to keep people safe and had just watched a secret nearly end everything, and he understood at last that the safest thing a dangerous truth can be is widely, plainly, permanently known. They would tell it. The ministry, the schools, the goblins, the whole reluctant world. There would be a record now, in every language, of the thing beneath the bank and the price of forgetting it, and the keeping of the world would no longer rest on a single dying quill in the dark, but on the oldest and most durable ward there is, which is a true story that everyone has heard. At the top the great bronze doors stood open on a London dawn, the first dawn Harry had not made for himself in 400 years, the sky going gold at the rooftops and green-blue overhead, and the morning star fading as the true sun took the sky. Harry Potter walked out of Gringotts into the light, a smaller thing than had walked in, and a freer one, and he stood on the steps where he had read a sunset a week and 4 centuries ago, and he watched the sun come up over a world that would, by his insistence, soon know exactly what it had nearly lost and exactly what kept it, and would be the safer for the knowing. Somewhere far below, a footnote waited, famous now, and would go on waiting, and would get precisely nowhere, because a remembered margin is only the quiet edge that lets the bright page mean something. And Harry, who had been the strongest thing in every room and had spent all of it to be, at the last, only a person among friends in a sunrise, discovered that he was hungry, ordinary morning hunger, the kind a warm kitchen could fix, and that Molly Weasley would have breakfast on by now, and that Sirius had, as promised, saved him a seat. "Come on," he said to the people who had come down into the dark for him, and his voice was only a voice now, a cracked and tired and entirely human voice. "I have been away a long time, longer than any of you know, and I will tell you all of it eventually, because I am done keeping things in locked rooms. Someone promised me there would be a warm room at the end of it, with all of you in it." He looked at the dawn one more time, and he let it be only a dawn, beautiful and ordinary, and not one bit forbidden to him any more. "Let's go home. I have 400 years of breakfast to catch up on, and the whole of an ordinary life to learn how to live, and for the first morning in longer than your histories run, I have absolutely no idea how any of it is going to turn out." He did not read the dawn, he simply watched it, the slow, uncertain human way, and let it surprise him. And it did. Chapter 7 end.